The soil weighed heavy on Ezra Morgan's hands, black and slick under the April rain. Droplets hammered his cheeks like cold accusations. The shovel sank deep into the earth, wet and heavy, each thrust drawing a soft groan from his lips. On this small hilltop under moonlight, filtered through the rain, Ezra dug a grave. Wind sliced through his collarbone, chilling, but not as cold as the despair spreading through his chest. "Damn it all," he whispered. "How did it come to this?" The rain fell harder, as if the sky were trying to wash away the sin and blood from the land. But nothing could cleanse the wounds carved deep into the soul. Ezra paused, looking down at the knee-deep hole he'd dug. Then he looked up toward his cabin not far away, where an oil lamp still flickered in the darkness. There, a woman who should be dead lay waiting for him. 12 hours earlier, everything had been normal, if one could call Ezra Morgan's reclusive existence normal. The creek running through the woods behind his cabin was where he came each morning drawing water and sometimes hunting, if fortune smiled. The babbling of the creek, the calling birds, and sunlight filtering through the Texas forest canopy had become his closest companions these past 3 years, ever since he'd left everything behind. That morning, Ezra knelt by the creek's edge, filling his last canteen, when he heard it. A pained moan, barely audible, but in the forest's quiet space, it rang out like a cry for help. He stood, hand on his gun grip, listening. Probably a wounded deer, he thought. But the doctor's instinct in him, the one he'd tried to bury these past 3 years, awakened. The sound came from downstream about 20 yards away. Ezra moved cautiously, step by step across slippery stones. And then he saw her. A woman collapsed against a fallen cottonwood, her calico dress torn and mud-stained. Blood seeped through the fabric at her shoulder, dark and fresh. Ezra estimated she couldn't be more than 25, with auburn hair tangled and matted with mud and dried leaves. When he approached, her eyes snapped open, blue as a winter sky, and just as cold. She scrambled backward against the log, one hand pressed to her wound, the other clutching at her skirt, as if hiding something. "Stay back," she whispered, voice rough as sandpaper. "Just stay back." Ezra stopped, hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "I don't aim to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady as when he'd once calmed wounded soldiers. "You're bleeding. Need that tended to." The woman's eyes darted around as if seeking escape, but her body had no strength left to run. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Hurt me." Her gaze fixed on some point past Ezra's shoulder, as if seeing something that wasn't there. "Mister, if you've got any kindness in you at all, you'll just kill me quick. Don't make it slow like they did." The words sent an icy chill down Ezra's spine. During the war years, he'd heard whispers in the camps about horrors that befell women caught in the wrong place, when the world went mad. Things that made decent men sick to think about. "Nobody's killing anybody," he said. "Let me look at that shoulder." "No." She pulled her knees up, making herself small. "You don't understand. If you touch me, you'll see what they did. Then you'll know, and you'll want to finish what they started. Try me." Something in Ezra's tone must have reached her, for she went still. He had learned patience in the war, how to wait out enemy fire, how to sit quiet in a foxhole while shells whistled overhead. He used that patience, now crouched by the creek, like a man waiting for fish to bite. Minutes passed. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the limestone bluffs. The creek murmured to itself, carrying last night's rain toward the Guadalupe River. Finally, the woman spoke. "My name is Sarah," she said, "Sarah Harlow. Ezra Morgan." He touched the brim of his hat. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Harlow." "Don't be," she replied, wincing as she shifted against the log. "Nothing pleasant about knowing me anymore." Ezra studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw, despite the fear in her eyes. "Let me see that wound." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, moving as if it hurt worse than the wound, she let her hand fall away from her shoulder. The fabric was torn raggedly, probably snagged on thorns during her flight through the brush. Ezra could see the furrow where a bullet had grazed her deep enough to bleed, but not life-threatening if kept clean. He moved carefully the way he'd approach a spooked horse. When he touched the torn fabric to examine the wound, Sarah flinched, but didn't pull away. "This will heal clean," he said. "Bullet just kissed you. Lucky." "Lucky." The word came out bitter. "That's me. Lucky Sarah Harlow." As Ezra worked cleaning the wound with creek water, he noticed other things. Old bruises, fading yellow-green along her arms, a split lip that had healed crooked. And when the torn fabric shifted, revealing more of her left leg, he saw what made his hands go still. On the pale skin of her inner thigh, burned deep and permanent, was a mark, not an accident, not a scar from some mishap with a cooking fire or branding iron gone astray. This was deliberate, precise, a word pressed into living flesh with heated metal, claiming ownership like you'd mark a steer. The word was property. Sarah saw where he was looking and jerked the fabric down her face, going white as creek foam. "Now you know," she whispered. "Now you see what I am." Ezra sat back on his heels, his jaw working. In 4 years of war, he'd seen men do terrible things to each other. He'd thought he'd seen the worst of what humans could manage when they set their minds to cruelty. But this marking a woman like livestock, this was something else entirely. "I see what they did to you," he said finally. "Not what you are." Tears came then, silent and steady. Sarah covered her face with both hands, shoulders shaking. "They had a whole place," she said through her fingers, "called it the collection, but it wasn't for cattle. Women who couldn't pay their debts, or whose menfolk ran off and left them owing, or who just got unlucky when the war came through. They took us there and—" She couldn't finish. Ezra felt something hot and violent rise in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when Union artillery cut down his regiment at Shiloh. But this wasn't enemy soldiers he wanted to hurt. This was something worse. Men who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. "How'd you get out?" he asked. "Fire." Sarah's eyes grew distant. "Place caught fire 2 weeks back. Guard who was supposed to be watching me was too busy saving his own skin. I ran." She looked down at her torn dress, her muddy feet. "Been running since." "Well," Ezra said, standing and offering his hand. "You can stop running now." She stared at his outstretched palm as if it might bite her. "You don't understand. Men like that, they don't let their property just walk away. They'll come looking. Let them look." Ezra kept his hand steady. "They'll find me instead." For the first time since he'd found her, something shifted in Sarah's face. Not trust. That would take time. But maybe the faintest possibility of it. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold and thin, but her grip was firm. Ezra helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed slightly from blood loss. "I got a cabin about 2 miles from here," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof and a door that bars from the inside. You can rest there while that shoulder heals." "Why?" The question came out sharp. "Why would you help me? What do you want?" Ezra thought about that as he whistled for his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Ruth, who came picking her way through the brush. He thought about the empty cabin he'd built with his own hands, after mustering out about the long nights when the silence sat heavy as a stone on his chest. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said. "Maybe you are too." He helped Sarah up onto Ruth's back, then swung up behind her. She held herself stiff at first, every muscle tensed, as if ready to bolt. But as they rode through the morning shadows, following deer trails and creek beds toward his hidden valley, he felt some of that tension ease. When they neared the cabin, Ezra felt her tense again. "This is your home?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Yes," he answered. "Built it after the war." "It's beautiful," she said softly. The cabin sat in a clearing ringed by cedar and oak, built low and solid against the Texas wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning to check his traps. "It's not much," Ezra said as he helped Sarah down from the horse. She stood in his dooryard, looking at the small vegetable garden, the split rail fence, the water barrel catching rain from the eaves. "It's peaceful," she said, and something in her voice made it sound like the highest compliment she could give. Inside the cabin was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs nearby. A bed in the corner, a shelf for his few books, pegs on the wall for his rifle and coat. "You can have the bed," Ezra said. "I'll make do with blankets by the fire." Sarah turned to look at him, and for the first time her expression held something besides fear, confusion, maybe as if kindness was a language she'd forgotten how to speak. "I don't understand you," she said. "Nothing to understand." Ezra stirred the coals in the fireplace, adding kindling until flames caught and danced. "You're hurt and scared, and got nowhere else to go. I got space and food and time. Seems simple enough." But as he watched her settle gingerly into one of his chairs, her hand unconsciously smoothing down her skirt to hide the brand on her thigh, Ezra knew nothing about this was going to be simple at all. But there was something else he noticed as he helped her remove her coat, a peculiar surgical scar on her wrist, a scar he'd seen before. A unique surgical technique that only he and his late mentor had ever used. Ezra had performed that surgery in the waning days of the war on a young woman badly injured after a hospital building collapsed. A surgery he thought had failed for the girl, had lost so much blood. He looked into Sarah's eyes, searching for a sign of recognition, but found none. This couldn't be coincidence, but he decided to keep silent. She'd been through enough, and he didn't want to overwhelm her with memories of another painful past. The first 3 days passed like a careful dance between 2 wounded animals. Ezra moved through his routines, checking his snares, tending his small garden, mending harness leather, while Sarah sat by the window watching him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with a price. She barely spoke those first mornings, just nodded when he offered her coffee or beans, shook her head when he asked if she needed anything. Her shoulder was healing clean, the angry red fading to pink. But Ezra could see other wounds that ran deeper than flesh. When night fell, he would hear Sarah's soft breathing from the bed, trying to hide her sobs. He realized she was crying very quietly, as if she'd learned to weep without being heard. He said nothing, knowing some hurts couldn't be mended with words, only with time and patient kindness. On the 4th morning, he found her standing by the looking-glass he'd hung near the wash basin. A cracked mirror he'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead. She was staring at her reflection as if she didn't recognize the face looking back. "Used to have longer hair," she said without turning around. It was the most words she'd spoken since telling him her name. Ezra paused in the doorway, a bucket of fresh water in his hands. "It grows back." They cut it off first thing. Her fingers touched the ragged ends that barely reached her shoulders. Said long hair was vanity, and vanity had to be beaten out of us. She turned from the mirror, and Ezra saw something raw in her eyes. You got scissors. I do. Why? Want to cut it proper. Clean like. She managed a ghost of a smile. Been thinking I might try to look like myself again. See if there's anything left worth looking at. Working careful as a barber, Ezra trimmed her hair until it fell neat and even around her face. Auburn waves caught the firelight, bringing out the golden strands that had been dulled by dirt and neglect. When he finished, Sarah looked younger somehow. The sharp angles of her cheekbones softened. Better? She asked, touching the newly trimmed ends. You look like a person again, Ezra said, then immediately wished he could take the words back. I know what you mean. Sarah stood and walked to the cracked mirror, studying her reflection. They tried to make us forget we were people, made us answer to numbers instead of names, fed us slop like we were animals. She traced a finger along her jawline. Some of the women, after a while, they started believing it, started thinking maybe that's all they really were. Ezra gathered up the fallen hair, tossing it into the fire, where it curled and vanished in the flames. What kept you from believing it? Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Anger. Pure, stubborn anger. Every time they tried to break me down, something inside me got madder. Figured if I was going to die, I'd die knowing I was still Sarah Harlow, not just some number branded on a list. That evening, as rain drummed against the cabin roof, Sarah surprised him by helping prepare supper. She moved around his small kitchen area with efficiency, cutting vegetables while he fried salt pork in his iron skillet. They worked without talking, but it was a different kind of silence than before, companionable rather than fearful. You got any family? She asked as they sat down to eat. Had a brother, Daniel. Ezra pushed beans around his plate. Lost him at Fredericksburg. Pa died of fever the winter before I enlisted. Ma followed him 6 months later. Couldn't bear to be left behind, I reckon. I'm sorry. I'm a long time ago now. He looked up at her. What about you? Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Had parents? Small farm outside Austin. Yankees came through in '63, took everything they could carry, and burned the rest. Pa tried to stop them, so they shot him. Ma lasted through the winter, but the grief took her come spring. That when you ended up at that place? No. Sarah set down her fork, her appetite apparently gone. Went to Austin, tried to find work. Met a man who said he'd help me, give me a job at his business. Her voice went flat. Turned out, his business was collecting women who had nowhere else to go. By the time I figured out what kind of help he was offering, it was too late. The rain kept falling, drumming harder against the roof. Ezra wanted to ask more about how long she'd been trapped, about how many others there were, about the men who'd done this to her. But he could see the cost of what she'd already told him, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Tomorrow I'll ride into Calico Springs, he said instead. Need supplies, medicine for that shoulder, maybe some cloth for a proper dress. Sarah's head snapped up. You can't. Someone might recognize. Nobody's going to recognize you. Your hair's different now, and you'll be wearing clean clothes. Besides, Calico Springs is 20 miles from here. Whoever's looking for you won't expect you to surface in a nothing town like that. You don't know these men. Fear crept back into her voice. They got connections everywhere. People who owe them money. People who are scared of them. They put word out about runaway property. Offer rewards. Then we'll be careful. Ezra reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were still cold. Always cold. Like the fear had settled into her bones. You can't hide in this cabin forever, Sarah. Sooner or later, you got to step back into the world. She stared down at his hand, covering hers. Why are you doing this? Really? It was a fair question. Ezra had been asking himself the same thing for 4 days now. He could have pointed her toward Austin, given her a few dollars, and wished her luck. Could have minded his own business and gone back to his quiet life of hunting and trapping and trying to forget what he'd seen in the war. Maybe because I know what it's like to feel like the world's got no place for you, he said finally. After the war, when I came back here, everything looked the same but felt different, like I was a ghost, walking through my old life. He turned her hand over, studying the calluses on her palm, the thin white scars that spoke of hard work and harder times. Maybe we both need to remember what it feels like to be alive again. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull her hand away. I don't know how to do that anymore. Be alive. I mean, feel things that aren't fear or anger or shame. We'll figure it out together. That night, Ezra lay by the fire, listening to the rain and the soft sounds of Sarah's breathing from the bed across the room. Sometime in the small hours, he heard her cry out. Not loud, just a small sound of distress that pulled him instantly awake. He found her sitting up in bed, staring at nothing, her body rigid with whatever nightmare had claimed her sleep. Sarah. He kept his voice low. Gentle, you all right? She turned toward him, and in the dying firelight he could see the tears on her cheeks. I dreamed I was back there. Could smell the smoke, hear the screams. She wrapped her arms around herself. Sometimes I think I'll never really get away. Part of me will always be in that place. Ezra rose from his bedroll and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked darkness. I used to dream about the war every night. Saw Daniel getting shot over and over again. Heard artillery in every thunderstorm. He turned back to her. Dreams fade. If you give them time, the real world gets stronger than the nightmares eventually. You believe that? I'm starting to. And then Sarah whispered something strange, something that made him turn to look at her. I knew you. He stood there silent, waiting. During the war, don't you remember? It's this scar. She lifted her wrist into the dim light. You saved me when the hospital collapsed. You were the surgeon who stopped me from bleeding to death. Ezra slowly walked to the bed and sat on the edge, taking her wrist in his hand, examining the scar carefully. I thought you died, he said, his voice rough. I didn't know you survived. Sarah gave a sad smile. I survived. Too many times. And that night, Ezra Morgan realized the grave he was digging wasn't for Sarah Harlow. It was for his own hate for the war memories he'd tried to bury too long, and for the fear she was trying to escape. A grave for the past, so they both could start living again. In the morning, the rain had stopped, and sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, turning the wet world outside into something that sparkled and gleamed. Sarah stood at the door, breathing deep of the clean air. Smells like growing things, she said. Spring's coming on strong now. Ezra joined her in the doorway. Few more weeks. Wildflowers will be everywhere. Blue bonnets, thick as carpet. I always loved spring. Something soft entered her voice. Pa used to say spring was God's way of reminding folks that nothing stays broken forever. Smart man, your pa. Sarah stepped out onto the small porch, lifting her face to the sun. Maybe we could go to Calico Springs today, if you still want to. Ezra studied her profile, noting the determined set of her chin, despite the lingering weariness in her eyes. You sure? No. She turned to look at him. and for the first time since he'd found her by the creek, she smiled a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look like the young woman she should have been. "But I'm tired of being scared, tired of hiding. If I'm going to live in this world again, I reckon I better start somewhere." As they prepared for the ride to town, Ezra watched Sarah braid her newly trimmed hair with careful fingers. She'd washed her face and hands in the basin, scrubbing away the last traces of dirt and fear. In his spare shirt and an old pair of pants cinched tight with rope, she looked small but determined. "Ready?" he asked, checking his rifle one more time before securing it to his saddle. Sarah nodded, though he could see her hands shake slightly as she adjusted the hat he'd given her. "Ready as I'll ever be." When they reached Calico Springs, Ezra couldn't help but notice how Sarah grew quieter, her eyes scanning the landscape as if searching for danger. He became more vigilant, too, war instincts awakening after a long slumber. "It's not a big town," he said as the first rooftops appeared in view. "But it has a good apothecary, and the general store sells everything from fabric to fishing hooks." Sarah nodded, but said nothing. Her hand gripped the edge of his coat, which she was wearing, to conceal her dirty and torn dress. Calico Springs nestled among limestone hills like a handful of buildings tossed by a careless giant. The main street was little more than packed dirt, rutted by wagon wheels, bordered by a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other enterprises that served the scattered ranchers and farmers of the hill country. They tied Ruth to the hitching post outside the apothecary, a small building with a faded sign reading Hammond Apothecary. As they entered, a small bell above the door jingled, and an elderly woman looked up from behind the counter. She had silver hair pulled into a neat bun and sharp eyes that held the wisdom of many years. "Ezra Morgan," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Been a long time since I've seen you. Thought you'd forgotten the way to town." "Mrs. Eleanor." Ezra dipped his head slightly. "I still remember the way. Just don't come down much." Eleanor's gaze settled on Sarah, who stood near the door with her head lowered. "And this is Sarah," Ezra said, offering no last name. "A friend from Austin, staying with me for a while." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but asked no further. Instead, she turned back to Ezra. "What do you need, doctor?" Ezra winced at the old title. "Not a doctor anymore, Mrs. Eleanor. Just a hunter now." She replied, her expression showing she wasn't convinced. "Well, then, Mr. Hunter, what can I help you with?" "Some iodine bandages and whatever pain medicine you have." While Eleanor gathered the items, Sarah tiptoed along the shelves, looking at the glass jars labeled in Latin. Ezra noticed her reading some labels, with recognition nodding slightly when she identified names. "You know a lot about herbs for a young woman," Eleanor said, making Sarah start. "Not many young ladies can read Latin names." Sarah looked up, her eyes flashing momentary panic, but it quickly disappeared beneath forced calm. "My father was a scholar," she answered quietly. "He taught me to read from an early age." A look of interest crossed Eleanor's features. "That's a precious gift your father gave you." Sarah nodded, then retreated near the door as if afraid that any attention might be dangerous. As Eleanor handed Ezra the medical supplies, she lowered her voice. "You need to be careful, Ezra. There are strangers in town. Not good people, likely." "What kind of strangers?" he asked, trying not to look toward Sarah. "Men dressed like merchants, but carrying guns under their coats. They've been asking about a young woman who ran away from someplace south of here. A woman of value to their employer." Ezra felt Sarah tense beside him, but she said nothing. "Thanks for the warning," he said, paying for the medicine. "I'll keep my eyes open." As they left the apothecary, Ezra could see Sarah trembling but she controlled it well. "We need fabric," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "And then we should leave." "Agreed. We'll be quick in and out of the general store." As they crossed the street to the general store, Ezra noticed a fresh paper tacked to the bulletin board outside the sheriff's office. He paused, pulling Sarah aside to look more closely. It was a wanted poster with a crude sketch of a young woman with dark hair. Though the drawing wasn't exactly like Sarah, it was close enough to recognize. The text read, "Wanted Sarah Harlow for questioning regarding murder and theft of property. $500 reward. Contact Mason Blackwood or Judge Harlan Reeves." Sarah drew in a sharp breath. "We should go," she whispered. "Now." But before they could turn back to their horse, the door to the sheriff's office opened, and a tall man dressed like an official stepped out. He was about 60, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a black three-piece suit, despite the heat, and a heavy gold watch dangled from his waistcoat pocket. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and cultured. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Judge Harlan Reeves." Ezra felt Sarah stiffen beside him. He kept his face neutral. "Ezra Morgan. I live a ways out of town." "Ah, one of our hunters, are you? I came to Calico Springs a few months ago, replacing Judge Abernathy after his passing." Reeves's gaze shifted to Sarah, who kept her head down, the hat concealing most of her face. "And this is—" "My sister," Ezra said without hesitation. "Mary, just visiting from San Antonio." "Pleasure to meet you, Mary." Reeves's voice was honeyed, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He gave her another once-over, then turned back to Ezra. "I hope you're keeping your eyes open, Morgan. We're looking for a dangerous fugitive, a young woman charged with murder. She might be hiding in the countryside." "I'll keep watch," Ezra said, reaching out to pull Sarah closer in a protective gesture. "But I don't see many people passing my way." Of course. Reeves smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This woman is quite dangerous, Mr. Morgan. She killed a respectable man and burned down a legitimate business. It's every citizen's duty to help bring her to justice." "I'll remember that." Ezra nodded politely. "We should be going. Got a lot to do before sundown." "Of course. Good day to you." Reeves touched the brim of his hat and stepped aside. But Ezra could feel the man's eyes following them as they crossed to the general store. Once safely inside, Sarah let out a shaky breath. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows it's me." "No, he suspects, but isn't certain," Ezra whispered back. "If he knew, he'd have arrested you on the spot. Let's get the fabric quickly and be on our way." Sarah nodded and quickly selected a bolt of blue cotton. They paid without delay and left riding Ruth out of town at a brisk but not suspiciously hurried pace. Only when they were several miles away and had turned onto a trail leading into the forest did Ezra let Ruth slow to a gentler walk. "You want to tell me about the murder charge?" he asked quietly. Sarah was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of memory. "I did kill a man," she said, her voice flat. "When I escaped. The one they called the Keeper. His real name was Lawrence. He—" She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He enjoyed hurting women, especially the new ones. It was his job to make them understand they weren't people anymore, that they were just property. That night, when the fire started, a kitchen fire that spread, he came to my cell. Not to release me, but to take advantage of the chaos. He thought no one would notice if a woman got hurt more in all the burning." Ezra felt a cold fury, but kept silent, letting her continue. "I took the knife he kept in his boot, and I put it in his throat." Her hands clutched Ezra's coat. I don't regret it. I would do it again. He was a monster, and what he did to those women, to me—" Her voice broke. "That was self-defense," Ezra said, his voice hard. "Any court in the land would see that." "Not any court with Judge Reeves presiding," Sarah replied bitterly. "He's part of it. He's the one who signs the debt papers, making everything legal. He and Mason Blackwood are partners in this collection of women." Ezra digested this information with growing anger. "How big is this operation?" "I don't know exactly. There were maybe 30 women at the place I was kept. But I heard guards talking about other locations. It's not just some small business, it's an entire network. They call it debt reconciliation, to make it sound legal, but it's slavery. They just found a way around the Emancipation Proclamation." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. When they reached a small stream, Ezra let Ruth drink while he refilled their canteens. "Do you think they'll come looking?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Ezra straightened, looking back the way they'd come. "Yes, but not today. Reeves will want to be sure before he sends men, and we'll be ready when they do come." As they continued their journey home, Sarah suddenly asked, "Were you really a doctor?" Ezra stiffened slightly. "Yes, Army surgeon for the Confederacy, 3rd Texas Infantry. What happened? Why aren't you practicing anymore?" He was quiet for a long time, the only sounds the creaking of Ruth's saddle and birds calling in the trees. "I lost my license," he finally said. "After the war, there was a procedure I performed. Experimental. The patient died, and they blamed me." "What kind of procedure?" "New technique for repairing severed arteries, like the one I used on your wrist." He glanced back at her. "You really don't remember me from the hospital." Sarah looked down at her scarred wrist. "I remember waking up with this scar. I remember a doctor with kind eyes, but I was delirious with pain and fever. I never knew your name." It was a field hospital outside Richmond, April of '65. Building took a direct hit from Union artillery. You were trapped under a beam that had severed the artery in your wrist. I used a technique my mentor had developed, never been tried on a battlefield before. "And it worked," she said softly. "On you, yes. But later, when I tried it again on a general's son, it failed. The boy died, and they said I was reckless experimenting on patients. They took my license." "I'm sorry." Ezra shrugged, but the tension in his shoulders belied his casual gesture. It was a long time ago. They reached the cabin as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. As they dismounted, Sarah suddenly froze, staring at the cabin door. It stood slightly ajar. "Ezra?" she whispered, pointing. He immediately pushed her behind him, drawing his pistol. "Stay with Ruth. If you hear shooting, ride hard and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "You will if it means saving yourself." His voice was firm. "Promise me." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Ezra approached the cabin cautiously, gun raised. He nudged the door open with his foot, scanning the interior. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed the rug near the fireplace had been moved. The loose floorboard beneath it, where he kept his small cache of money and important papers, was slightly askew. He checked every corner, ensuring no one was hiding inside, then returned to the door and motioned for Sarah to join him. "Someone was here," he said grimly, "searching, but they're gone now." Sarah entered cautiously, eyes wide. "How did they find us so quickly?" "I don't know. Maybe they followed us from town. Maybe someone talked." Ezra knelt by the floorboard, checking his hidden cash. "They took the cash, but left the papers." "What now?" Sarah asked, fear creeping back into her voice. Ezra stood holstering his pistol. Now we prepare. They know where we are, which means they'll be back. And next time, they'll come in force. As evening fell, they barred the door and windows. Ezra cleaned his rifle and pistol, checking and rechecking the ammunition. Sarah sat at the table, the blue fabric forgotten beside her, as she watched him with growing apprehension. "I should leave," she said suddenly. "This is my fight, not yours." Ezra looked up from his rifle. "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere far from here. Mexico, maybe." "You wouldn't make it 10 miles, he said bluntly. "Not with Reeves and his men watching the roads." "I can't let you risk your life for me," her voice caught. "Not after everything you've done already." Ezra set the rifle down and crossed to her, kneeling before her chair so they were eye to eye. "Sarah, listen to me. What these men are doing, it's not just about you. It's about every woman they've branded, every person they've treated like property. Someone has to stand against them." "Why does it have to be you?" His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Because I've spent 3 years hiding from the world, trying to forget what I saw in the war. Trying to forget what it means to fight for something that matters. Maybe it's time I remembered." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not worth dying for, Ezra." "Everyone is worth dying for," he replied softly. "That's what makes us human." The air between them grew charged with something neither was ready to name. Sarah reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing his cheek in a touch so light it might have been imagined. The moment was broken by a sound from outside, a branch snapping in the darkness. Ezra was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Someone's out there," he whispered. "Stay low." Sarah slid from her chair to the floor, pressing herself against the wall beneath the window. Ezra extinguished the lamp with a quick breath, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the dim glow of coals in the fireplace. For long minutes they remained motionless, listening. The night sounds of the forest crickets and owls' distant call seemed unnaturally loud in their heightened awareness. Then another crack, closer this time. Ezra moved silently to the door, positioning himself to the side rifle ready. A soft scratching came from the other side of the door, someone testing the bar. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called out, "Dr. De Morgan, it's Eleanor Hammond. I'm alone, and I mean no harm." Ezra and Sarah exchanged surprised glances in the darkness. He moved back to the window, peering out cautiously. In the pale moonlight, he could make out the elderly woman from the apothecary standing alone in the clearing. "What do you want?" Ezra called, keeping his rifle ready. "To help," came the reply, "and to warn you. Please let me in. It's not safe out here." Ezra hesitated, then nodded to Sarah. "Stay back from the door, just in case." He lifted the bar carefully and opened the door just enough to verify Eleanor was indeed alone. Satisfied, he ushered her in quickly, then rebarred the door. "How did you find us?" he demanded as Sarah relit the lamp. Eleanor's face was grave in the flickering light. "I followed you this morning at a distance. I needed to be sure." "Sure of what?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with suspicion. The older woman turned to her, eyes softening. "Sure that you were who I thought you might be, Sarah Harlow." Sarah tensed, ready to flee, but Eleanor raised a calming hand. "I'm not here to hurt you, child. Quite the opposite. I've been looking for you for weeks." "Why?" Ezra asked, still not lowering his rifle completely. Eleanor sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 65 years. "Because I run what you might call an underground railroad for women escaping from Mason Blackwood's collection houses. And because, she turned to Sarah, I believe you might be my niece's daughter. The revelation hung in the air, stunning both Ezra and Sarah into momentary silence. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. My mother's name was Catherine Hammond Harlow. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Yes, my brother William's daughter. We lost touch during the war. I never knew what became of her or her family. Sarah swayed slightly, overwhelmed by this connection to a past she thought lost forever. Ezra moved to support her, guiding her to a chair. How can we trust you? He asked Eleanor bluntly. You can't, not entirely, she admitted, but you need allies, and I need your help. Blackwood's operation is larger and more dangerous than either of you realize, and after today you've become their primary targets. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. Judge Reeves issued this not an hour after you left town. Ezra took the paper and unfolded it. It was another wanted poster, but this one included his name alongside Sarah's. The charges, harboring a fugitive obstruction of justice and assault on a peace officer, crimes that could hang a man in Texas. They're coming for you, Eleanor said gravely. Tonight, most likely, and they won't be taking prisoners. How many? Ezra asked, mind already calculating odds and options. At least 6 men well armed. Reeves is leading them personally. Sarah stood suddenly, her face set with determination. Then we need to leave. Now. Ezra nodded. Pack only what's essential. We'll head north, try to lose them in the hill country. As they hurriedly gathered supplies, Eleanor watched with a pained expression. There's something else you should know, she said hesitantly. Something about the night of the fire at the collection house. Sarah paused, a bundle of clothing in her hands. What about it? It wasn't an accident. I said it. The confession hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah stared at the older woman, shock evident on her face. You... Eleanor nodded. I've been working against Blackwood for years, ever since I discovered what he was doing. The fire was meant as a distraction so we could free the women inside. But it spread faster than intended. In the chaos, many escaped, but some... She looked down, grief etching lines around her eyes. Some didn't make it out. Why are you telling us this? Ezra asked. Because you need to understand what you're up against. Blackwood isn't just some local slaver. He's connected to powerful people across the state. Judges, politicians, wealthy ranchers. They all benefit from his operation. She looked directly at Sarah. And because you need to know you're not alone in this fight. There are others, a network of people working to bring down Blackwood and his kind. A sudden noise outside, the distinctive sound of horses approaching, cut their conversation short. Ezra moved to the window, peering through the shutters. Torches, he said grimly. At least 5 riders coming fast. Eleanor's face paled. They must have followed me. I was so careful. No time for that now, Ezra said, grabbing his rifle and ammunition. Is there a back way out of here? Eleanor nodded. Through the root cellar. There's a tunnel my husband dug during the war, leads to a cave about a 1/4 mile from here. Sarah looked confused. What root cellar? There isn't. Ezra was already moving, pulling back the rug near the fireplace and lifting the loose floorboards to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Never mentioned it, because I never thought I'd need it, he explained, grabbing a lantern. Daniel's idea said every home should have an escape route. As the sound of approaching horses grew louder, they hurriedly gathered the most essential supplies. Ezra handed Sarah his pistol. You know how to use this. She took it with steady hands. Yes, my father taught me. Eleanor pulled a small revolver from her bag. I'm not defenseless either. Ezra nodded, impressed, despite the dire circumstances. Let's go then, and quietly. As they disappeared into the darkness beneath the cabin, the first riders reached the clearing outside. Through the floorboards they could hear voices calling, demanding surrender. Then came the sound of the door being forced open, boots on the wooden floor above their heads. "Search everything," a commanding voice ordered Judge Reeves. "They can't have gotten far." In the narrow tunnel beneath the cabin, 3 figures moved silently away from danger, guided only by the dim light of a covered lantern and the desperate hope of escape. And above them, Ezra's cabin. The home he had built with his own hands, his sanctuary from the world, erupted in flames, as Reeves and his men set it ablaze, determined to flush out their quarry or destroy them in the process. The bright orange glow penetrated even the earthen tunnel, a stark reminder that there would be no going back. Only forward into an uncertain future, fraught with danger, but also lit by the faint possibility of justice and freedom. The tunnel beneath Ezra's cabin was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing them to move in single file, hunched over to avoid scraping their heads. The earthen walls pressed in close, smelling of damp soil and forgotten time. Ezra led the way, holding the covered lantern just high enough to illuminate a few feet ahead, while Sarah followed close behind Eleanor, bringing up the rear. Above them, muffled by layers of dirt and timber, came the sounds of destruction, boots stomping across floorboards, furniture being overturned, glass shattering. Then, most chilling of all, Judge Reeves's voice, cold with authority. Burn it all." Sarah glanced back, her face ghostly in the dim light. "Your home, just wood," Ezra murmured, though his jaw tightened. "Keep moving." The tunnel sloped downward for 100 yards, then leveled out as the ceiling rose enough for them to stand upright. The air grew cooler with the distinct mineral scent of limestone. "Daniel and I dug this during the early days of the war," Ezra explained softly as they walked. "He was always worried about Union raiders or deserters turned bandits. Said a man needed an escape route." "Your brother was a wise man," Eleanor said from behind. "Paranoid, I called him then." Ezra's voice held the bitterness of hindsight. "Turns out, being paranoid doesn't mean you're wrong." The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a natural limestone cave. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a slow, steady percussion that had continued undisturbed for centuries. Ezra raised the lantern, revealing stalactites hanging from the ceiling like petrified tears. "We can rest here a moment," he said, setting the lantern on a flat rock. "They won't find the tunnel entrance right away." Sarah sank onto a boulder, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "What now? Where do we go?" Eleanor lowered herself onto another rock, her movements stiff with age. "I have a place," she said. "A safe house about 5 miles north of Calico Springs. Been using it for the underground route for nearly 2 years now. Nobody knows about it except those who need to." "We can't go back to Calico Springs," Ezra objected. "That's the first place they'll look." "Not to the town itself," Eleanor clarified. "The house is hidden in a box canyon accessible only by a trail so narrow most folks don't even know it exists. We'd be safe there at least for a few days while we plan our next move." "And what is our next move?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "Keep running forever." Eleanor's eyes gleamed with determination in the lantern light. "No, child. We fight back. We bring down Mason Blackwood and his entire operation." The audacity of the statement hung in the air. Ezra studied the older woman with new respect, seeing beyond the respectable apothecary owner to the steel beneath. "How exactly do you propose we do that?" he asked. "Blackwood has money connections, men with guns. We're 3 people, one of us past 60, begging your pardon, ma'am, with 2 pistols and a rifle between us. We're not alone, Eleanor replied. Like I said, there's a network. People who've been working against Blackwood for years. Former slaves, women who've escaped his collection houses, men who've lost daughters and sisters to his operation. We've been gathering evidence, making connections, waiting for the right moment to strike. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper despite their isolation. Blackwood keeps records, detailed ledgers of every woman, every debt, every transaction. If we could get our hands on those, where would he keep such things? Sarah asked. At the main collection house, a plantation about 30 miles south of here. It's where he lives, where he conducts his business. Ezra shook his head. That's a fortress. I've heard rumors about the place. High walls, armed guards' dogs. We'd never get near it, let alone inside. Not from the outside, no, Eleanor agreed. But from the inside, Sarah's eyes widened as she understood. You want to use me as bait. Eleanor didn't deny it. You're the only one who's been inside and escaped. You know the layout, the routines. And Blackwood wants you back badly enough that he might make mistakes. No, Ezra's voice was flat. Absolutely not. We're not dangling Sarah in front of that monster. It wouldn't be without protection, Eleanor insisted. We have people. I said no. Ezra stood looming over the elderly woman. We'll find another way. Sarah touched his arm gently. Ezra, wait. Her eyes, when they met his, held a resolve he hadn't seen before. Eleanor's right. I know that place. I know how it works. And if there's a chance to free the others, they'll kill you, Ezra said, his voice cracking slightly. Or worse. Maybe. She managed a small, sad smile. But I'm already dead in so many ways. At least this way, my death might mean something. You're not dead, he insisted, covering her hand with his. You're here, you're alive, and I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself. A sudden noise from the tunnel, a scattering of pebbles, the softest scrape of boot on stone, cut their conversation short. Ezra immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. Someone's coming, he whispered, the words barely audible. Stay silent. They froze, barely breathing, as the faint sounds grew more distinct. One person moving slowly, cautiously, feeling their way through the darkness of the tunnel. Ezra silently drew his knife, quieter than the rifle if it came to that. He positioned himself between the tunnel entrance and the women, every muscle tense, ready to strike. A faint glow appeared at the tunnel mouth, growing stronger as the intruder approached. Then a figure emerged into the cave, holding a shuttered lantern, much like their own. Dr. Morgan, a young voice called softly. Mrs. Hammond, are you here? Eleanor exhaled sharply. Thomas, is that you? Yes, ma'am. The lantern opened slightly, revealing a young man no more than 20, dressed in simple farm clothes, a revolver tucked in his belt. You didn't return, and I got worried. Saw the cabin burning and figured you might have used the escape route. How did you know about the tunnel? Ezra demanded, still gripping his knife. Mrs. Hammond told me, the young man replied, seemingly unfazed by Ezra's threatening posture. I'm Thomas Jenkins. I work with her with the underground. Eleanor stepped forward. Thomas is one of our most trusted couriers. He helps guide women to safety. Ezra lowered his knife, but remained wary. How many others know we're here? No one, sir, Thomas answered promptly. Mrs. Hammond sent word to meet her at the crossroads tonight, but when she didn't show, I tracked her to your cabin. Stayed hidden in the trees when Reeves and his men arrived. Are they still there? Sarah asked. Thomas nodded grimly. Watching the place burn. Mighty pleased with themselves, too. But they're starting to organize search parties. We shouldn't stay here long. Eleanor turned to Ezra. We need to move. Now. Reluctantly, Ezra nodded. The boy's right. If they find the tunnel entrance, they'll be on us before we know it. There's a second exit, Thomas offered. Leads out to a gulch about a quarter-mile north. I've got horses waiting there. Ezra studied the young man's face for any sign of deception, but found only earnest determination. Lead on, then, he finally said, gathering their few belongings. But I'll be right behind you, and my knife's still sharp. Thomas didn't seem offended by the implied threat. Yes, sir. This way. He led them deeper into the cave, past limestone formations that glistened like jewels in the lantern light. The path narrowed again, requiring them to turn sideways in places, but eventually opened to a steep, upward passage that ended at what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Thomas handed his lantern to Eleanor, then pressed his shoulder against the stone, pushing with surprising strength for his slender frame. Slowly the rock moved, revealing it to be a cunningly disguised door, made of wood and canvas, painted to look like limestone. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. Thomas checked outside, then motioned them forward. All clear? The horses are just down the slope. They emerged into a narrow gulch, the night sky above them a ribbon of stars between towering cliffs. True to his word, Thomas had 3 horses tethered to a scrub oak, saddled and ready. The big bay's for you, Dr. Morgan, Thomas said, untying the reins. He can carry 2 without trouble. Ezra helped Sarah mount behind him, then watched as Eleanor settled onto a gentle-looking mare with Thomas's assistance. The boy took the 3rd horse, a nimble pinto, that danced impatiently as he mounted. Stay close and stay quiet, Thomas instructed, keeping his voice low. The safe house is about an hour's ride if we stick to the back trails. We'll need to cross the main road once, but I know a spot with good cover. With Thomas in the lead, they set off through the gulch, riding single file along a narrow game trail that wound between boulders and across shallow streams. The horses moved sure-footedly, despite the darkness, accustomed to the rough terrain. Ezra rode with one arm holding the reins, the other resting on his rifle across his lap. Behind him, Sarah held tightly to his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. He could feel her trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. You all right? He asked softly, when they paused to let the horses drink at a small spring. Yes, she answered, though her voice belied the word. Just remembering what it was like, being hunted. He reached back, covering her hand with his. You're not alone this time. That's what frightens me most, she admitted. Before, it was just my life at stake. Before Ezra could respond, Thomas returned from scouting ahead. Riders on the main road, he reported, keeping his voice low. Moving fast, heading east. Looks like some of Reeves's men. Think they spotted us? Ezra asked. Thomas shook his head. Don't believe so. They're still following the road, not cutting cross-country. But we should take the high pass instead of the valley route, just to be safe. The high pass is mighty steep in the dark, Eleanor cautioned. Can't be helped, Thomas replied. Better steep than caught. They continued on the trail, growing steeper as promised, zigzagging up the face of a limestone cliff. The horses labored, breathing heavily in the cool night air. Twice they had to dismount and lead the animals on foot around particularly treacherous sections. Finally, they crested the ridge and paused to rest the horses. From their vantage point, they could see for miles in the moonlight rolling hills, patches of forest, and in the distance the faint orange glow of Ezra's burning cabin. Everything I had, he murmured, staring at the distant flames. Everything I built. Sarah touched his shoulder gently. I'm sorry. This is my fault. He shook his head. No, it's theirs. and they'll answer for it." The set of his jaw and the cold fury in his eyes made Sarah shiver. This was a different Ezra than the gentle healer who had found her by the creek. This was a soldier, a man who had seen war and knew how to wage it. "We should keep moving," Thomas urged, already back in his saddle. "We're exposed up here." They continued along the ridge for another mile, then began their descent into a heavily wooded valley. The trees grew so thick that they blocked out most of the moonlight, forcing them to trust their horses' instincts on the narrow trail. After what seemed an eternity of tense silence, broken only by the soft footfalls of the horses and the occasional night bird's call, the trail opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a modest cabin, its windows dark, nearly invisible against the tree line. Thomas dismounted and whistled a distinctive pattern, 3 short notes, 1 long. After a moment, a lantern appeared in one of the windows, and the cabin door opened slightly. "That you, Thomas?" a woman's voice called softly. "Yes, Martha. Bringing guests." The door opened wider, revealing a middle-aged woman with dark hair streaked with gray, holding a rifle with comfortable familiarity. She surveyed the newcomers with sharp eyes, then nodded once. "Bring them in, quickly." Inside the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture, and shelves stocked with supplies. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the space with savory aromas that reminded Ezra how long it had been since they'd eaten. Martha secured the door behind them, sliding a heavy wooden bar into place. "You're safe here for now," she said, setting her rifle aside, but keeping it within reach. "No one comes to this valley except those who know the way." Eleanor embraced the woman warmly. "Martha, thank you. These are the ones I sent word about, Dr. Ezra Morgan and Sarah Harlow." Martha nodded to them both. "Any enemy of Blackwoods is a friend of mine. Sit, eat. You look half dead with exhaustion." As they settled around the rough-hewn table, Martha ladled generous portions of venison stew into wooden bowls. Ezra hadn't realized how hungry he was until the food was before him, and for several minutes no one spoke as they ate. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "What's the plan now, Mrs. Hammond?" Eleanor sighed, looking suddenly older in the firelight. "We need to get word to the others. Reeves will have men watching all the roads, and Blackwood will certainly send reinforcements once he hears what's happened." "I can ride out at first light," Thomas offered. "Take messages to the safe houses." "Too dangerous," Martha objected. "Patrols will be heaviest at dawn." "We need information more than anything," Ezra said, pushing his empty bowl aside. "We need to know exactly what we're up against, how many men, where they're positioned." Sarah, who had been quiet since their arrival, suddenly spoke up. "What we need is leverage." All eyes turned to her. "Blackwood values 2 things above all else, his money and his reputation." She continued, her voice growing stronger. "He pretends to be a legitimate businessman, a pillar of society. What if we exposed him, showed the world what he really is?" "How?" Martha asked. "The local newspaper's owned by his cousin, and the nearest federal marshal is in San Antonio, 3 days' ride from here." "The ledgers," Eleanor said, understanding dawning on her face. "If we could get the ledgers prove what he's doing—" "Even better," Sarah said, leaning forward. "What if we had him admit it, in his own words, in front of witnesses?" Ezra shook his head. "Blackwood's too careful for that." "Not if he thought he was winning," Sarah insisted. "Not if he thought he had me cornered helpless. His pride would make him boast I've seen it before." "No," Ezra said firmly. "We've already discussed this. I'm not letting you use yourself as bait." "It's not your decision to make," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "It's mine, and I choose to fight." The tension between them was palpable. Eleanor cleared her throat softly. Perhaps we should all get some rest, she suggested. Decisions made in exhaustion are rarely the best ones. Martha nodded agreement. There are beds in the back room. Not much, but better than the ground. I'll take first watch, Thomas volunteered, checking his revolver. Wake me for second, Ezra said, still looking at Sarah with concern. As the others prepared for sleep, Ezra touched Sarah's arm, holding her back. Can we talk outside? She hesitated, then nodded. They stepped onto the small porch, closing the door behind them. The night was cool and clear, 1,000 stars scattered across the velvet sky. For a moment, they stood in silence, each gathering their thoughts. I understand why you want to do this, Ezra finally said. But there has to be another way. What if there isn't? Sarah asked softly. What if this is our one chance to end it, not just for me, but for all the women Blackwood has taken, and all the ones he will take if we don't stop him? The risk is too great. For whom, me? She turned to face him fully. Ezra, look at me. Really, look. What do you see? He studied her face in the starlight, the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the determined set of her jaw, the haunted shadows in her eyes. I see someone who's survived hell, he said honestly. Someone strong enough to escape when others couldn't. Someone brave enough to keep fighting when most would surrender. Then trust that strength, she urged. Trust me to know what I can endure, what risks are worth taking. Ezra ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. It's not that I don't trust you. It's that He stopped abruptly. It's that you, what? She pressed. It's that I can't bear the thought of losing you. He admitted the words, coming out rough and raw. Not now, not after everything. The confession hung in the air between them. Sarah's expression softened, and she reached up to touch his face, her fingers light against his stubbled cheek. I spent 2 years believing I would die in that place, she said quietly. Every day I expected it to be my last. But it wasn't death I feared most. It was dying without having truly lived, without having made my life mean something. Her hand dropped to his shoulder, then to his chest, resting over his heart. You gave me back my freedom, Ezra. Now let me use it for something that matters. He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his chest. I just found you, he whispered. I'm not ready to let you go. Then don't, she replied. Come with me. Fight beside me. But don't ask me to hide when I could be making a difference. Ezra closed his eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of her hand beneath his, the steady beat of his own heart. When he opened them again, his decision was made. All right, he said, but we do this smart. We plan every detail, prepare for every contingency. And at the first sign that things are going wrong, we abort. Sarah nodded, relief evident in her posture. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he warned. First, we have to convince the others, and then we have to survive whatever plan we come up with. She smiled, then a genuine smile that transformed her face, making her look like the young woman she should have been if life had been kinder. We will. We've come too far to fail now. Impulsively, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. Before he could react, she had turned and gone back inside, leaving him standing alone on the porch, his hand touching the spot where her lips had been. Above him, a shooting star traced a brilliant arc across the night sky, a good omen, his mother would have said. Ezra wasn't sure he believed in omens anymore, but in that moment, he allowed himself to hope. Dawn broke with a soft golden light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ezra, who had taken the last watch, sat on the porch steps, cleaning his rifle as the others gradually awakened inside the cabin. The door opened behind him, and Eleanor emerged with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Ezra, then settled beside him on the step, her joints creaking softly. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Well enough," he replied, taking a grateful sip of the bitter brew. "No sign of pursuit so far." "That won't last," Eleanor said grimly. "Reeves is tenacious, and Blackwood won't tolerate a challenge to his authority." Ezra nodded, running a cloth down the rifle barrel. "We've been talking about getting our hands on Blackwood's ledgers, but there's something I don't understand. Why keep such incriminating evidence at all? Why not destroy it?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "Because, for all his evil, Blackwood is first and foremost a businessman. Those ledgers are his proof of ownership, his record of debts and payments. Without them, he couldn't maintain his operation or prove his legal claims to the women he holds. So they're both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability," Ezra mused. "Precisely." The door opened again, and Sarah joined them, dressed in a clean but ill-fitting dress that Martha must have provided. Her hair was neatly combed, and she had washed her face, giving her a fresher appearance, despite the worry lines etched around her eyes. "Morning," she said, accepting the cup of coffee Eleanor poured from a small pot she'd brought outside. "We were just discussing Blackwood's ledgers," Ezra told her. Sarah's expression darkened. "He keeps them in a safe in his study. I've never seen it myself, but I heard the guards talking about it. Only Blackwood and Judge Reeves know the combination." "And the study is inside the main house, I presume?" Ezra asked. She nodded. "Second floor, east wing. It has a balcony overlooking the grounds. Blackwood likes to stand there and survey his kingdom." The disgust in her voice was palpable. Eleanor patted her hand sympathetically. "Sarah, dear, I know this is difficult, but we need to know everything you can tell us about the layout, the guards, the routines." Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to describe the plantation that had been her prison for 2 years. The main house was a grand antebellum structure with columned porches and wide hallways. Behind it stood the quarters, a euphemism for the prison barracks, where the women were kept when not working. "The grounds are surrounded by a 10-foot wall," she explained, drawing a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "There's only one gate always guarded. Inside, there are usually 8 to 10 guards patrolling during the day, fewer at night." "Dogs?" Ezra asked. 3 mastiffs, mean as sin and trained to attack anyone trying to leave without permission." "And inside the main house?" "At least 2 guards at all times, plus household staff, a cook-housekeeper, and Blackwood's personal valet. All men, all armed." Ezra frowned, studying the crude map. "Sounds like a fortress." "It is," Sarah confirmed. "Designed to keep people in, not out. But that doesn't make it any less difficult to penetrate." Thomas and Martha joined them, bringing more coffee and a plate of cornbread. As they discussed options, Thomas mentioned something that caught Ezra's attention. "What did you say about a tunnel?" he asked sharply. Thomas looked surprised. "Just that there are rumors the old plantation house has underground passages, supposedly built during the early days of the Republic as escape routes in case of Mexican raids. But it's probably just talk. I've never met anyone who's actually seen them." Sarah sat up straighter. "No, it's true. I've seen one of the entrances. It's in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. I found it once when I was assigned to kitchen duty, but I couldn't explore it. The door was locked from the other side." "Where would it lead?" Eleanor wondered. "If it follows the pattern of other plantation tunnels I've heard of," Martha said, "probably to a point beyond the walls, maybe to the river that runs along the eastern boundary of the property." Ezra's mind was working rapidly. "If we could get inside that tunnel, we'd still need to get past the locked door, Find the study, crack the safe, and get out again without being caught, Sarah pointed out. One problem at a time, Ezra said. First, we need to locate the tunnel's exterior entrance. Thomas, do you know the area well? The young man nodded. I've hunted those woods since I was a boy. If there's an opening somewhere, I can find it. Good. You and I will go tonight, scout the perimeter, see what we're dealing with. I'm coming too, Sarah said firmly. Ezra started to object, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. All right, he conceded. You know the place better than any of us. Eleanor cleared her throat. While you three are scouting, Martha and I will make contact with our network. We'll need supplies, weapons, and possibly distractions when the time comes. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Martha produced a small arsenal from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, revolvers, rifles, even a few sticks of dynamite left over from a mining operation. My late husband believed in being prepared, she explained, seeing Ezra's raised eyebrow. Thomas found paper and charcoal, and Sarah worked with him to create a more detailed map of the plantation from memory. She marked guard posts, the location of the dog kennels, and the various buildings, trying to recall every detail that might prove useful. As she worked, Ezra noticed her hands trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. Without drawing attention to it, he moved to sit beside her, his shoulder touching hers in silent support. She glanced at him gratefully, and the trembling eased. By late afternoon, their plan had taken shape. Thomas, Sarah, and Ezra would leave after dark to scout the plantation's perimeter, focusing on the eastern boundary where the rumored tunnel might exit. They would observe guard patterns and possible approaches, but would not attempt entry, not yet. Meanwhile, Eleanor had written several coded messages for Thomas to deliver to allies in neighboring settlements. If all went well, within 3 days, they would have the support needed for a more substantial operation. As dusk approached, tension mounted in the small cabin. Ezra checked and rechecked his weapons, while Thomas prepared the horses. Sarah changed into darker clothing that would blend better with the night binding her auburn hair beneath a dark cap. Be careful, Eleanor urged as they prepared to depart. Observation only. Don't take unnecessary risks. We'll be back before dawn, Ezra promised, adjusting his gun belt. The night was clear but moonless, perfect for their purpose. They rode single file through the forest, Thomas leading the way along game trails only he could see in the darkness. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. After about 2 hours of steady riding, Thomas raised his hand, signaling a halt. We're getting close, he whispered as they gathered around him. About half a mile ahead, the forest ends at the plantation's eastern boundary. There's a river that runs along the property line, shallow this time of year, easy to cross. Guards? Ezra asked. Usually 1 or 2 patrolling the river line, but they stick mostly to the bridge and ford. The southern bend is less watched, thick brush, rough terrain. Sarah nodded. That's our best approach then. If the tunnel exits anywhere, it would be in that area far from the main routes, concealed by vegetation. They left the horses secured in a small clearing, continuing on foot. Thomas moved with the silent grace of an experienced hunter, leading them through the underbrush without snapping a single twig. Sarah followed her movements, almost as quiet, while Ezra brought up the rear alert for any sign of danger. The forest gradually thinned, and soon they could see glimpses of open ground ahead. Thomas motioned them down, and they crawled the last few yards to the edge of the tree line. Before them stretched a broad meadow silvered by starlight. Beyond it, separated by a winding river, rose the dark silhouette of a plantation house. Blackwood's domain. Even at this distance, the scale of the place was impressive. A grand main house flanked by numerous outbuildings, all surrounded by a high wall that gleamed pale in the darkness. There, Sarah whispered, pointing. The eastern wing, that's where his study is with the balcony. Ezra studied the layout through a small spyglass he'd brought. He could make out the shapes of guards walking the perimeter of the wall and the occasional glint of lantern light from within the compound. "Heavily secured," he murmured. "This won't be easy." "The tunnel is our best hope," Thomas said. "If it exists, and if we can find it." They worked their way south along the forest edge, keeping to the shadows, eyes scanning the riverbank for anything unusual. The night was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, frogs calling from the river, the occasional hoot of an owl. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when Sarah suddenly gripped Ezra's arm. "Wait," she breathed. "Look there, where the bank curves inward. See that darker patch of shadow." Ezra squinted in the direction she indicated. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just a tangle of vines and brush cascading down the riverbank. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed an odd regularity to one section of the vegetation, as if it were concealing something man-made. "Could be," he acknowledged. "But we need a closer look." "I'll go," Thomas volunteered. "I can cross the river here and check it out." "Too risky," Ezra objected. "If you're spotted, I won't be," the young man assured him with quiet confidence. "I've been dodging Blackwood's patrols for years." Before Ezra could protest further, Thomas had slipped away, moving like a shadow toward the river. They watched as he eased into the water crossing with barely a ripple, then disappeared into the heavy brush on the far bank. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Sarah's hand found Ezra's in the darkness, squeezing tight. He returned the pressure, his thumb brushing reassuringly across her knuckles. "He'll be all right," he whispered, hoping he was right. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 minutes, they saw movement on the far bank. Thomas reappeared crossing the river as silently as before, then made his way back to their position. "It's there," he reported, excitement barely contained in his hushed voice. "A small stone arch, hidden by vines and brush. Looks man-made old. The entrance is blocked by an iron grate, rusted but still solid." "Locked?" Ezra asked. Thomas nodded. "Padlocked from the outside. Old lock, though shouldn't be too hard to break. And it's big enough to pass through. Barely. Have to crawl, but it's passable." Sarah exhaled slowly. "That has to be it. The tunnel entrance." Ezra studied the distant plantation house, his mind calculating distances and angles. "If it connects to the root cellar, as you remember, that's a good quarter-mile of tunnel. No telling what condition it's in after all these years." "Only one way to find out," Sarah said. "Not tonight," Ezra cautioned. "We've confirmed it exists. That's enough for now. We'll come back tomorrow with proper tools and more information." Reluctantly, they retreated, making their way back to where they'd left the horses. The return journey was tense but uneventful, and they arrived at the safe house just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Eleanor and Martha were waiting anxiously, relief evident on their faces as the three scouts entered the cabin. "We found it," Thomas announced triumphantly. "The tunnel entrance is right where Mrs. Harlow thought it might be." As they shared a hasty breakfast, they recounted their discovery and began formulating the next phase of their plan. They would need tools to break the lock lanterns for the tunnel and weapons for whatever awaited them inside. "I've had word back from 2 of our contacts," Eleanor reported. "Jacob Miller and his sons can provide distraction on the north side of the plantation tomorrow night. They'll make it look like a raid on the livestock. Should draw most of the guards away from the eastern perimeter. And I've prepared medical supplies," Martha added. "Bandages, laudanum, sulfa powder, just in case." The gravity of what they were planning settled over the group. This wasn't just reconnaissance anymore. They were preparing for a direct infiltration of Blackwood's stronghold, an action that could easily result in bloodshed. "There's something else we need to discuss," Ezra said, his voice serious. "What happens if we succeed? If we get the ledgers, what then?" "We take them to the federal marshal in San Antonio," Eleanor answered. "With proof of what Blackwood's doing, they'd have to act." "And if they don't?" Sarah asked quietly. "If Blackwood's influence reaches even there?" The question hung in the air unanswered. They all knew the reality. Men like Blackwood rarely faced justice through official channels. Too much money, too many connections, too many people willing to look the other way. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Ezra finally said. "First, let's focus on getting those ledgers." As the others continued discussing logistics, Ezra noticed Sarah slip outside. After a moment he followed, finding her sitting on the porch steps, staring into the distance. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, gently settling beside her. She shook her head. "No, just preparing myself. Going back there, even through a secret tunnel, it won't be easy." "You don't have to go. Thomas and I could—" "I do have to go," she interrupted. "I'm the only one who knows the interior layout, and—" She paused, searching for words. "And I need to face it. Face him. Otherwise, I'll never truly be free." Ezra understood. Some demons couldn't be outrun, they had to be confronted directly. "I'll be with you," he promised. "Every step of the way." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why, Ezra? Why are you risking everything for me? For this fight that wasn't yours to begin with?" He considered the question seriously, looking past the easy answers to the truth beneath. "Maybe because for 3 years I've been hiding from the world, telling myself I was at peace, when really I was just empty. Or maybe because when I found you by that creek, something woke up inside me that I thought had died in the war." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward until her forehead rested against his shoulder. Ezra's arm came around her, holding her gently as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the porch. They stayed that way for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, preparing for the battle ahead. Whatever happened in the coming days, they would face it together. The doctor who had lost his purpose and the woman who had lost her freedom, both finding something unexpected in each other. Inside the cabin, preparations continued. Maps were studied, weapons cleaned, supplies gathered. But on the porch, in a moment of quiet connection, Ezra and Sarah found something just as valuable as any physical resource, a reason to keep fighting when all seemed lost. The day passed in a flurry of preparations. Thomas and Martha worked on creating distractions, small explosive charges that would create noise and confusion without causing serious harm. Eleanor sorted medical supplies and wrote more messages to allies, while Ezra cleaned and checked every weapon they had available. Sarah spent hours with a piece of charcoal and paper drawing increasingly detailed maps of the plantation's interior from memory. The process clearly pained her, bringing back memories she'd rather forget, but she persisted with grim determination. By late afternoon, they had assembled their equipment: dark clothing tools for breaking the lock on the tunnel grate, lanterns, weapons, and basic medical supplies. The plan was to leave at dusk, position themselves near the tunnel entrance by full dark, then wait for Jacob Miller's distraction before making their move. As they made final preparations, a rider approached the cabin, a boy no more than 14 mounted on a lathered horse that had clearly been ridden hard. Thomas met him outside, spoke briefly, then hurried back in with a grave expression. "News from town," he reported. "Blackwood himself has arrived in Calico Springs, brought 20 men with him all armed. They're searching every farm and homestead within 10 miles. The news sent a ripple of tension through the group. Eleanor's face paled. "They're closer than we thought." "That changes things," Ezra said, thinking quickly. "If they're searching systematically, they'll reach this area by tomorrow, maybe sooner." "We need to move tonight," Sarah insisted, "before they find us." Ezra nodded grimly. "Agreed, but we'll need to adjust the plan. Thomas, can your friend Miller still provide the distraction?" "He'll be ready. I can send the boy with a message." "Good. Tell him we're moving earlier than planned. We need the diversion at midnight, not dawn." As Thomas went to dispatch the messenger, Ezra turned to Eleanor and Martha. "You two should leave now. Head for the next safe house. It's too dangerous here." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I'm staying. You'll need a lookout and someone to tend any wounds if things go badly." "And I go where Eleanor goes," Martha added, her tone brooking no argument. Ezra saw the determination in their eyes and knew better than to waste time arguing. "All right, but you stay well back from the action, understood. If things go wrong, your job is to get away clean and warn the others." With the new urgency, they finished their preparations and set out as soon as dusk began to fall. They traveled lighter than originally planned, taking only what was essential. The women rode double on Martha's sturdy mare, while Ezra and Thomas each took their own mounts. They approached the plantation from the southeast, using the deepening shadows for cover. The night was cooler than the previous one, with high clouds occasionally obscuring the stars. Perfect conditions for their purpose. They left the horses in the same clearing as before, concealed among thick brush, with Martha staying behind to guard them. The others continued on foot, moving silently through the forest until they reached the vantage point overlooking the plantation. The grand house was illuminated by lanterns and oil lamps, light spilling from numerous windows. Even at this distance, they could see unusual activity, men on horseback, coming and going, extra guards posted at the wall. "Blackwood must have sent word ahead," Thomas whispered. "They're on high alert." Ezra studied the scene through his spyglass. "More guards than yesterday, and dogs patrolling inside the walls." "Should we abort?" Eleanor asked. Ezra glanced at Sarah, whose face was set in determined lines. "No," he decided. "If anything, this confirms we're on the right track. Blackwood's worried, he knows we're a threat." They worked their way cautiously toward the river and the concealed tunnel entrance. The additional guards made their approach more challenging, forcing them to move with extreme care, freezing in place whenever a patrol passed nearby. Finally, they reached the overgrown riverbank where Thomas had discovered the tunnel grate. Ezra sent Thomas upstream to watch for patrols while he examined the rusted iron barrier. "Old padlock," he murmured to Sarah, who crouched beside him. "Shouldn't be too hard to break." From his pack, he produced a small pry bar and a length of cloth to muffle the sound. Working carefully, he wrapped the cloth around the lock, then applied steady pressure with the bar. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a muffled crack, the ancient mechanism gave way. They waited, hardly breathing, listening for any sign their activity had been detected. When no alarm came, Ezra carefully removed the broken lock and eased the grate open. It moved reluctantly, hinges protesting after years of disuse. Beyond lay a low stone arch, just large enough for a person to crawl through. A dank, musty smell emanated from the opening, the scent of earth and stagnant air, long undisturbed. "I'll go first," Ezra whispered, lighting a small shuttered lantern. "Sarah follows. Eleanor, you stay here with Thomas. If we're not back in 3 hours, assume something went wrong and get clear." Eleanor nodded, though her expression showed she wasn't happy with the arrangement. "Be careful," she murmured, embracing them both briefly. Ezra turned to Sarah. "Last chance to change your mind." Her answer was to take the second lantern and light it. "After you, Doctor." With a grim smile, Ezra got down on his hands and knees and crawled into the tunnel entrance. Sarah followed close behind, while Eleanor pushed the grate partially closed behind them, hiding it once more beneath the overgrowth. The tunnel was smaller than Ezra had anticipated, forcing them to crawl for the first 20 yards. The air was thick with dust, and the remnants of old cobwebs making breathing difficult. Their lanterns cast eerie, shifting shadows on the curved stone walls. Finally, the passage widened and heightened enough for them to stand, though Ezra still had to stoop to avoid hitting his head. The floor was packed earth mercifully dry, despite the tunnel's proximity to the river. "Someone maintained this over the years," Ezra observed quietly. "It's in too good a condition to have been completely abandoned." "Blackwood probably uses it to smuggle in special guests," Sarah replied, her voice tight with old anger. "Men who want to visit the collection without being seen publicly." They continued forward, moving as quickly as caution allowed. The tunnel curved gradually to the left, following what Ezra guessed was the natural contour of the land rising toward the plantation house. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 minutes, they reached a junction where the main passage continued straight ahead, while a narrower offshoot branched to the right. "Which way?" Ezra whispered. Sarah studied the paths, brow furrowed in concentration. "Main passage should lead to the root cellar, if I remember correctly. No idea where the other goes. Let's stick with what we know." They continued along the main tunnel, which began to slope upward more steeply. The air grew marginally fresher, suggesting they were nearing an opening to the surface. Finally, they reached what appeared to be a dead end, a solid wall of fitted stones. "This can't be right," Ezra muttered, raising his lantern higher to examine the obstacle. Sarah moved closer, running her fingers along the stones. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at this." She pointed to what appeared to be a small imperfection in the mortar between two stones. Pressing it firmly, she was rewarded with a faint click. When she pushed against the wall, a section moved inward, revealing it to be a cunningly disguised door. Beyond lay darkness and the smell of root vegetables and damp earth, the cellar just as Sarah had remembered. She extinguished her lantern, and Ezra did the same. They listened intently for any sound of movement, but the cellar appeared deserted. Cautiously, they stepped through the hidden door, easing it closed behind them. The root cellar was larger than Ezra had expected, with rough wooden shelves lining the walls, stocked with preserved foods and various supplies. A staircase at the far end presumably led up to the kitchen. "Now what?" Ezra whispered. "The study is on the second floor, east wing," Sarah replied softly. "We need to get upstairs without being seen." "Servants' stairs," she nodded. Through the kitchen, then a narrow staircase at the back of the house, less likely to be guarded than the main staircase. They moved silently toward the cellar steps, pausing to listen for any movement above. Hearing nothing, they ascended cautiously, finding themselves in a large, well-appointed kitchen. A single lamp burned low on a central work table, but the room was deserted. "Staff must be asleep," Sarah whispered. "It's well past midnight." They crept through the kitchen to a narrow hallway beyond, then followed it to a discreet door that concealed a steep, cramped staircase, the servants' access to the upper floors. As they climbed, the stairs creaked occasionally despite their care, each sound seeming thunderous in the quiet house. At the top they emerged into a dimly lit corridor. Sarah oriented herself quickly, pointing to the right. "That way. Third door on the left." They moved silently along the plush carpet, staying close to the wall. As they approached the study door, Ezra drew his pistol, holding it ready. Sarah tried the handle, carefully locked as expected. From his pocket, Ezra produced a set of slender metal tools. At Sarah's questioning look, he shrugged. Picked up a few skills during the war. He worked on the lock with practiced movements, and within moments they heard a satisfying click. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a spacious, luxuriously appointed study beyond. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating leather-bound books, expensive furniture, and a massive desk of polished mahogany. Behind the desk hung a large portrait of a distinguished-looking man in his 40s. Mason Blackwood himself, Sarah confirmed with a disgusted murmur. They closed the door behind them and risked lighting one lantern, keeping it dimmed as low as possible. The safe they sought was hidden behind a small landscape painting to the right of the desk, a predictable location that made Ezra wonder if Blackwood's confidence had made him careless. The safe itself was more of a challenge, a modern model with a complex combination lock. Ezra examined it closely, knowing that breaking in would require time and skill he wasn't certain he possessed. "Any idea of the combination?" he asked Sarah. She shook her head. "Never saw it opened." Ezra placed his ear against the safe and began to turn the dial slowly, listening for the subtle clicks that might reveal the mechanism's secrets. It was delicate work, requiring complete concentration. He was so focused that he almost missed the faint sound from the hallway, a floorboard creaking under someone's weight. Sarah heard it too, her hand closing urgently on his arm. They extinguished the lantern, immediately plunging the room into moonlit darkness. Footsteps approached, unhurried but purposeful. Then a key turned in the lock. Ezra pulled Sarah toward the heavy velvet curtains beside the window, the only hiding place in the room. They slipped behind the thick fabric just as the door opened, pressing themselves against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. A man entered. They could hear him moving about the room, the strike of a match, the soft glow of a lamp being lit. Through a tiny gap in the curtains, Sarah could see a portion of the room. Her fingers dug into Ezra's arm when the man came into view. Mason Blackwood himself, looking much like his portrait, tall, elegantly dressed, despite the late hour, with silver threading through his dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He moved to the desk and sat pulling papers from a drawer and beginning to write. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Ezra's muscles began to cramp from holding still, and he could feel Sarah trembling beside him. The slightest noise would give them away, and Blackwood's position at the desk left them no path to either the door or the hidden passage behind the painting. Then, unexpectedly, salvation came in the form of a distant explosion, Jacob Miller's distraction, right on schedule. Blackwood's head snapped up at the sound. A second explosion followed, then shouting from the grounds below. Blackwood rose quickly, moving to the window, the very window they were hidden beside. For a heart-stopping moment, he stood close enough that Sarah could have reached out and touched him. Then he strode to the door, pausing only to lock the safe quickly before hurrying out. As soon as his footsteps faded, they emerged from hiding. "That was too close," Ezra breathed, moving immediately to the safe. "He just used the combination," Sarah pointed out. "Did you see it? Got the last two numbers?" Ezra confirmed. "Should make this easier." He set to work again, using what he'd observed to narrow down the possibilities. Outside, more explosions sounded, followed by gunfire and the barking of dogs. Their diversion was working perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. "Hurry," Sarah urged, keeping watch at the door. "That much commotion will bring reinforcements." Ezra worked feverishly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. Finally, with a soft click, the safe door swung open. Inside lay several leather-bound ledgers, stacks of cash, and a small wooden box. Sarah grabbed the ledgers while Ezra quickly examined the box. Inside lay a collection of gold coins and what appeared to be property deeds. He pocketed these along with a handful of the cash, then closed the safe, replacing the painting to hide the evidence of their theft. "Let's go," he whispered, moving toward the door. But before they could reach it, the sound of approaching footsteps made them freeze once more. Not just one person this time, several men moving quickly. "Back to the tunnel," Sarah hissed, gesturing toward the servants' stairs. They slipped out of the study and hurried down the corridor, the ledgers clutched tightly to Sarah's chest. They had almost reached the servants' door when a shout rang out behind them. "There, intruders!" Ezra spun, raising his pistol as two armed men appeared at the far end of the hallway. He fired once, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back for precious seconds. The shot hit the wall beside the lead guard, sending him diving for cover. "Run!" Ezra urged, pushing Sarah toward the stairs. They raced down the narrow staircase, footsteps thundering behind them. In the kitchen they encountered a startled cook, just rising from sleep at the commotion. The man reached for a knife, but Ezra's gun persuaded him to reconsider. "Where are the rest of the women kept?" Ezra demanded. "The collection, where are they?" The cook's eyes widened in fear. "North Barracks," he stammered. "But you'll never reach them, too many guards." With a frustrated curse, Ezra pushed past him, following Sarah toward the root cellar. They could hear shouting throughout the house now, the entire plantation awakening to the alarm. In the cellar, they quickly located the hidden door, slipping through just as boots pounded on the kitchen stairs above. They didn't stop to close it properly, knowing pursuit would be immediate. They ran through the tunnel, no longer bothering with stealth, their lanterns bouncing wild shadows off the stone walls. Behind them came shouts and the glow of more lanterns. The guards had found the passage. "They're gaining!" Sarah gasped as they reached the junction where the tunnel split. Ezra made a split-second decision. "Take the side passage," he ordered. "It might throw them off." The narrower tunnel twisted sharply, forcing them to slow their pace. The sounds of pursuit seemed to recede slightly, suggesting their pursuers had continued along the main passage. After several more turns, the tunnel began to slope upward steeply. They emerged panting into what appeared to be an abandoned spring house, a small stone structure half collapsed with age, overtaken by vegetation. "Where are we?" Sarah whispered, clutching the precious ledgers. Ezra peered through a gap in the crumbling wall. "Still on plantation grounds, I think, but outside the main compound." In the distance they could see the grand house ablaze with lights, men with torches spreading out across the grounds, searching. Dogs barked frantically, but the commotion from Jacob Miller's diversions had thoroughly confused them, sending them racing in all directions. "We need to reach the river," Ezra said. "Find Eleanor and Thomas." They slipped out of the spring house, staying low and using every bit of cover available: clumps of bushes, garden walls, ornamental statuary. The night was their ally, the shadows deep enough to conceal their movements if they were careful. They had almost reached the outer wall when disaster struck. Rounding a hedge, they came face to face with a patrol, two guards with rifles, as startled by the encounter as they were. Ezra reacted instantly, tackling the nearest guard before he could raise his weapon. They went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting desperately for control of the rifle. Sarah faced the second guard, who leveled his weapon at her chest. "Drop the books," he ordered. "Hands up." For a moment, she seemed to comply, lowering the ledgers slightly. Then, with surprising speed, she hurled them directly at the guard's face. As he instinctively raised his arms to block, she launched herself forward, driving her shoulder into his midsection. The guard staggered, but didn't fall. He grabbed Sarah by the hair, yanking her head back cruelly. Before he could strike her, Ezra's pistol barked once, and the man collapsed with a bullet in his thigh. Ezra himself was bleeding from a cut above his eye, where the first guard had struck him with a rifle butt, but the man now lay unconscious at his feet. "You all right?" he asked Sarah, helping her gather the scattered ledgers. She nodded grimly, a bruise already forming on her cheek. "We need to move. That shot will bring others." They ran again, heading for the wall. Finding a section partially obscured by tall ornamental shrubs, they used a gardener's ladder left conveniently nearby to scale the barrier, dropping down on the other side into tall grass. The river lay just 50 yards ahead, a silver ribbon in the moonlight. As they reached its bank, a whistle sounded from the underbrush. Thomas's signal. "Here," Ezra called softly. Thomas and Eleanor emerged from their hiding place, relief evident on their faces. "We heard shooting," Eleanor said anxiously. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious," Ezra assured her, though blood still trickled down his face. "But we need to move, now." "We got the horses closer," Thomas reported, "just through those trees." They hurried away from the plantation, the sounds of alarm still ringing out behind them. The ledgers were secure, but Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that they'd left something important undone. "The women," he said as they reached the horses. "We couldn't free them." Sarah's face was grim in the moonlight. "Not tonight, but soon." She patted the ledgers tied securely to her saddle. "With these, we'll bring Blackwood down, and then all his property will be free." As they mounted and rode into the forest's protective darkness, Ezra knew they had won a significant victory. But the war was far from over. Blackwood would be furious, more dangerous than ever. And now they had painted targets on their backs that would never fade until one side or the other was defeated. The ledgers might be their weapon, but only if they could get them to someone willing to act on the evidence they contained. And in a world where men like Blackwood wielded immense influence, that might prove the most challenging task of all. They rode hard through the night, following deer trails and shallow streams to obscure their tracks. The moon had set by the time they reached Martha's cabin, leaving only starlight to guide them through the final stretch of forest. No one spoke during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts, alert for sounds of pursuit. Martha met them at the door, rifle in hand, her weathered face creased with worry. "Thank the Lord," she breathed, ushering them inside. "I heard the explosions. Wasn't sure you'd make it back." "We got what we came for," Ezra said, helping Sarah dismount. She carried the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, clutching them like precious cargo. Inside the cabin, they collapsed around the table, exhausted, but too wired to rest. Martha brought them coffee and cold biscuits, then tended to Ezra's cut above the eye while Eleanor examined Sarah's bruised face. "Nothing broken," the older woman pronounced. "You'll have quite a mark for a few days, though." Sarah barely seemed to hear her attention fixed on the ledgers now spread across the table. "We need to examine these," she said, her voice hoarse with fatigue and emotion. "See what they tell us." Ezra wanted to suggest they rest first, but the intensity in Sarah's eyes stopped him. This wasn't just about evidence, it was about confronting the system that had stolen years of her life, branded her like livestock, treated her as property rather than a person. By lantern light, they began to review the records. The ledgers were meticulously kept, each entry written in a precise, elegant hand. Names, dates, amounts, the cold arithmetic of human bondage laid out in columns of black ink. "Here," Sarah said suddenly, her finger tracing a line on the page. "This is me, S. Harlow, acquired April 18, 1864. Initial debt, $87.50 for medical care and funeral expenses." Her voice trembled slightly as she continued reading. "Additional charges, food and lodging, $1.25 per day. Discipline expenses, $5 per incident. Branding and registration, $3.50. Ezra felt sick as he looked over her shoulder at the accounting of a human life reduced to dollars and cents. By the ledger's calculation, Sarah's debt had grown to over $2,000 in 2 years, an impossible sum for any woman to repay under such circumstances. "And here," Eleanor said, pointing to another volume, "are the payments made against the debts. Look at this entry. Jenkins, 3 visits to Harlow, $75. Sarah's face went pale. "They charged men to use us, and counted it as payment against our debts. But the amounts they charged us for expenses always grew faster than any payments. A system designed to ensure no one ever earns their freedom," Ezra said grimly. As they continued through the ledgers, a pattern emerged. Blackwood's operation wasn't limited to a few dozen women as they'd thought. The records detailed over 200 acquisitions across multiple locations with connections to similar operations in neighboring states. Most disturbing were the entries marked transferred or sold contract women whose debts had been purchased by other men, effectively selling the women themselves while maintaining the fiction of debt collection. "This is slavery," Thomas said, his young face hard with anger, "just with different papers." "And look at these names," Eleanor added, pointing to a section labeled Investors and Partners. "Judge Reeves, of course, but also Senator Hopkins, Sheriff Taylor from Mason County, Reverend Walsh. Half the power structure in 3 counties," Martha observed. "No wonder Blackwood operates with impunity." Ezra rubbed his eyes, fighting exhaustion. "This is bigger than we thought. Taking these ledgers to the marshal in San Antonio might not be enough. Too many influential people implicated. They could bury the evidence or worse." "Then we go higher," Eleanor said firmly. "The governor, or straight to federal authorities in Washington." "That would take weeks," Sarah objected. "Meanwhile, those women are still captive, and Blackwood knows we have the evidence. He'll destroy anything else that could incriminate him, maybe even—" She couldn't finish the thought. "She's right," Ezra agreed. "We need to act quickly before Blackwood can cover his tracks or move his collection elsewhere." They debated options until dawn lightened the eastern sky. Thomas stepped outside periodically to check for signs of pursuit, but the forest remained quiet. Either they had successfully evaded Blackwood's men, or more likely he was regrouping, planning a more coordinated search. "We need to split up," Ezra finally decided. "Thomas, you take the ledgers and Eleanor to San Antonio. Martha, you alert the network. Get word to every safe house within 50 miles. Tell them to be ready to receive women who might need shelter." "What about you and Sarah?" Eleanor asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "We're going back," Sarah said before Ezra could respond, "to free the others." "That's suicide," Martha protested. "The place will be on highest alert. Blackwood will be expecting you." "Not if we create a bigger distraction than he's expecting," Ezra countered. "Something that draws away not just the guards, but Blackwood himself." A plan began to take shape, audacious, dangerous, but with a slim chance of success. Thomas would not only carry the ledgers to San Antonio, but would stop in neighboring settlements to rally support. With the evidence they now possessed, they might convince enough people to stand against Blackwood's operation. "We'll need 3 days to gather forces," Thomas estimated. "Can you remain hidden that long?" Ezra exchanged glances with Sarah. "We'll manage. There's an abandoned trapper's cabin near the North Ridge, remote enough that Blackwood's men are unlikely to find it." They spent the morning making final preparations, dividing supplies, and planning rendezvous points. As the sun climbed higher, they knew they needed to move soon. Blackwood's search parties would be spreading outward from the plantation, methodically covering the surrounding countryside. Thomas departed first, the precious ledgers secured in his saddlebags, Eleanor riding double behind him. They would take a roundabout route to San Antonio, staying off main roads and using the network of safe houses for shelter. Martha left an hour later, heading west to alert allies. She would return to her own home afterward, as the local apothecary, her sudden disappearance, would draw unwanted attention. Alone in the cabin, Ezra and Sarah gathered the last of their supplies. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other with the ease of people who had quickly learned to anticipate each other's needs. "You don't have to come with me," Sarah said, suddenly pausing in her task of rolling bandages. "To the trapper's cabin, I mean. You could go with Thomas, make sure the ledgers reach the right hands." Ezra looked up from where he was checking his pistol. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "I'm just saying, you've done enough already. Lost your home, risked your life. You don't owe me anything more." He set the gun down and moved to where she stood, gently turning her to face him. "Sarah, look at me." When she raised her eyes, he could see the conflict there, determination mixed with fear, hope shadowed by doubt. "I'm not staying with you out of obligation," he said quietly. "I'm staying because there's nowhere else I'd rather be. Because when I found you by that creek, something changed for me. Something I thought was dead woke up again." "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Purpose, hope." He hesitated, then added softly, "The feeling that maybe the world isn't as broken as I thought." Her expression softened, and she reached up to touch the bandage Martha had placed over his cut. "Even with all this, with Blackwood and his kind still out there, especially with all this, because now we're fighting back." His hand covered hers where it rested against his face. "And I don't want to fight without you beside me." For a moment, they stood there, connected by touch and gaze, the unspoken depth of feeling between them hanging in the air like morning mist. Then Sarah leaned forward and kissed him not on the cheek as before, but fully on the lips, a gesture of both tenderness and fierce determination. When they separated, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Then let's fight together," she said, "to the end, whatever that may be." They left the cabin shortly afterward, riding north through increasingly rugged terrain. The trapper's cabin Ezra had mentioned was remote for good reason, situated in a narrow box canyon, accessible only by a steep, treacherous trail that discouraged casual visitors. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered, and thunder rumbled in the distance. They pushed on, reaching the canyon just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The cabin itself was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a stone fireplace, its roof partially collapsed at one corner. "Not exactly luxurious," Ezra commented as they led the horses inside to escape the downpour, "but it should keep us hidden." They made the best of their temporary refuge, clearing debris and repairing the worst of the roof leaks with canvas from their supplies. By nightfall, they had a small fire going in the fireplace, its light carefully shielded to prevent it being seen from outside the canyon. The rain continued through the night, drumming on the remaining roof sections and dripping steadily through the gaps. They sat close to the fire, sharing a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack, listening to the storm. "What made you become a doctor?" Sarah asked, suddenly breaking a long but comfortable silence. Ezra looked up, surprised by the question. "My father was a physician," he replied after a moment. "Country doctor, traveled for miles around our home in Virginia. I used to ride with him sometimes, watching him tend to everything from farm injuries to childbirth." "You admired him?" "I did. He had this calm about him. No matter how dire the situation, he never panicked. said panic was a luxury a doctor couldn't afford. Ezra smiled faintly at the memory. He died when I was 16. Pneumonia. Ironic for a man who saved so many others. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Ezra poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. What about you? You have medical knowledge unusual for a woman your age. Sarah nodded. My mother was a midwife. Father taught literature at a small college in Boston before the war. He believed women should be educated same as men, so he taught me alongside my brothers Latin, Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy. Your brothers both died at Antietam. Her voice grew distant. After that, Father lost his position at the college. The trustees didn't approve of his radical views on the war. We moved to Texas to start fresh, but then the Union forces came through. She trailed off the story, all too familiar. Ezra didn't press for more details. Instead, he asked, Do you still remember it? The medical knowledge? Some, she admitted. I assisted Mother with deliveries, learned about herbs and remedies. During the war, I volunteered briefly at a field hospital. That's where you treated me, though I was barely conscious at the time. You'd have made a fine physician, Ezra observed, if the world were more just. Perhaps it will be someday. She gazed into the fire. For the next generation, if not for us. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. As the night deepened, books they had read, places they had seen, small moments of beauty or joy remembered from before the war had torn the country apart. It was strange, Ezra thought, to find such peaceful connection in the midst of danger, like finding a sheltered eddy in a raging river. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them. They spread their bedrolls near the fire, close enough to share warmth, but with a respectable distance between them. Despite his fatigue, Ezra found sleep elusive, his mind racing with plans and contingencies for the days ahead. He was still awake when Sarah began to whimper in her sleep, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Without thinking, he moved to her side, gently touching her shoulder. Sarah, he whispered, you're dreaming. You're safe! She woke with a sharp intake of breath, eyes wide and disoriented. For a moment, she seemed not to recognize him. Then clarity returned, and she sat up, pushing hair from her face with trembling hands. I was back there, she said hoarsely, in the collection house. They were... She shook her head, unable to continue. Ezra simply opened his arms, offering comfort without demands. After a brief hesitation, she moved into his embrace, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I wonder if the nightmares ever stop, she murmured. They change, he answered honestly. Become less frequent. Some nights, you might even sleep peacefully, but they never disappear completely. They become part of you like scars. Not very comforting. No, he agreed. But true. And there's this, the pain reminds us we survived. That we're still here, still fighting. She was quiet for so long, he thought she might have fallen asleep again. Then, barely audible over the rain, she whispered, Thank you. For what? For seeing me. Not what they made me, not what they did to me. Just me. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture as natural as breathing. Always. They stayed that way until dawn, finding in each other's presence a peace neither had known in years, fragile, perhaps temporary, but real nonetheless. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, leaving a world washed clean, ready for a new day. The next 2 days passed in tense anticipation. They remained largely confined to the cabin, venturing out only when necessary to check their surroundings or gather water from a nearby spring. Twice they spotted search parties in the distance, riders moving methodically through the valleys below, but none approached the difficult trail leading to their canyon. On the morning of the third day, they heard a distinctive bird call. That wasn't a bird at all, but Thomas's signal. Ezra responded with a similar call, and soon the young man appeared at the mouth of the canyon leading his pinto horse. "You made it," Sarah greeted him with evident relief. "The ledgers, safe with the federal marshal in San Antonio," Thomas confirmed, accepting the cup of coffee Ezra offered. He was skeptical at first, but once he saw the evidence, especially the names of his own superiors listed as investors, he promised action. "How soon?" Ezra asked. "That's the problem. Bureaucracy moves slow. He's sending telegrams to Washington gathering more lawmen. Could be a week or more before they move against Blackwood." Sarah shook her head firmly. "The women can't wait that long. Blackwood will either move them or worse." "I know," Thomas agreed. "That's why I also spread the word locally. Every ranch hand, farmer, and shopkeeper who's ever lost a daughter, sister, or wife to Blackwood's operation. They're gathering at Miller's place tonight, 30 men at least, maybe more." Ezra whistled softly. "An armed mob isn't exactly what I had in mind." "Not a mob," Thomas corrected. "A militia. These are mostly veterans men who fought on both sides but now have a common enemy. They're disciplined and they're determined." "What's the plan?" Sarah asked. Thomas outlined the strategy they'd developed. The militia would approach the plantation from multiple directions, creating a diversion at the main gate, while smaller groups targeted the wall's weakest sections. Their primary objective was the women's barracks, freeing the captives and escaping with minimal bloodshed. "Blackwood has hired additional guards," Thomas warned, "nearly doubled his force since your raid, but most are stationed around the main house, protecting him rather than the perimeter." "He's scared?" Sarah observed with grim satisfaction. "Good." They spent the rest of the day making final preparations. Ezra checked and rechecked their weapons, while Sarah drew detailed maps of the plantation's interior marking guard positions and the most direct routes to the women's quarters. As sunset approached, they mounted up and began the journey to Miller's farm, taking a circuitous route to avoid potential patrols. The weather had turned again, with heavy clouds building on the horizon and a damp chill in the air that promised more rain before morning. They arrived to find a scene that both heartened and concerned Ezra. True to Thomas's word, at least 30 men had gathered in Miller's barn, a diverse group ranging from grizzled veterans to boys barely old enough to shave. They were armed with an assortment of weapons, rifles, shotguns, pistols, even a few Civil War sabers. Jacob Miller himself was a burly man in his 50s with a thick gray beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working under the Texas sun. He greeted Ezra and Sarah with a firm handshake and clear, assessing eyes. "Thomas speaks highly of you both," he said without preamble. "Says you know the inside of Blackwood's hellhole better than anyone." "I was held there for 2 years," Sarah replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I know every corner of it." Miller nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his features. "My youngest daughter, Emma, was taken 3 years ago, supposedly for a debt I never owed. Haven't seen her since, though I've tried every legal channel available." The personal cost of Blackwood's operation was written on every face in that barn. Each man had a story: a sister who'd disappeared after her husband died, owing money, a sweetheart who had gone to work as a seamstress in town and never returned, a daughter sent to deliver a package who never made it home. Ezra realized with growing unease that this wasn't just a rescue mission for these men. It was vengeance, justice delayed but not forgotten. Such motivation made for determined fighters, but also increased the risk of violence spiraling out of control. "Our primary objective must be freeing the women," he emphasized when Miller asked him to address the group. Not revenge, not property damage, not confronting Blackwood himself. We get in release, the captives get out. The federal marshals will handle the legal consequences afterward. Some of the men nodded agreement, but others exchanged glances that suggested they had additional plans of their own. Ezra couldn't entirely blame them, but he worried about the potential for bloodshed, including the very women they were trying to save caught in crossfire. As Miller outlined the final details of their plan, Sarah moved to stand beside Ezra, her shoulder brushing his. "They won't listen," she murmured, pitching her voice for his ears alone. "Not completely. There's too much pain, too much anger." "No," he acknowledged. "But if we can keep the focus on the rescue long enough to get the women clear, what happens after—" He let the thought hang unfinished. Sarah studied the determined faces around them. "Some of these men will die tonight," she said softly. "You realize that—" "Yes." The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders. "But they've made their choice, same as us." The assembly broke into smaller groups, each assigned to different entry points around the plantation's perimeter. Ezra, Sarah, and Thomas would join Miller's team, targeting the eastern wall near the women's barracks, the most direct route to their objective, but also likely to be well defended. As they prepared to depart, Eleanor appeared at the barn door, medical bag in hand. She'd come from San Antonio, having ensured the ledgers were safely delivered. "You didn't think I'd let you face this without me, did you?" she asked when Ezra expressed surprise at her presence. "It's too dangerous," he objected. "You should stay here, be ready to treat the wounded when we return." Eleanor fixed him with a stern gaze. "I've been fighting Blackwood's kind of evil for longer than you've been alive, young man. I'll be where I'm needed, and that's with those women when they're finally freed. Many will need immediate medical attention." Recognizing the futility of argument, Ezra nodded reluctantly. "Stay with Miller's group, then, and keep your head down." They moved out as full darkness descended, traveling in small groups along different routes to avoid detection. The plan called for them to take positions around the plantation by midnight, then launch coordinated attacks from multiple directions shortly thereafter. Ezra rode beside Sarah, acutely aware that this might be their last quiet moment together. The future, always uncertain, seemed particularly fragile tonight, balanced on the edge of a blade that could cut either way. "Sarah," he began, then faltered, unsure how to express the tangle of emotions he felt. She glanced at him, her face half hidden in shadow. "I know," she said simply. "Me too." The simple acknowledgement was enough. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, they both understood what had grown between them, a connection forged in shared danger and mutual respect, tempered by compassion and strengthened by purpose. They reached their designated position, a dense thicket of trees, about 200 yards from the eastern wall, just before midnight. Miller's group, consisting of 8 men, plus Ezra, Sarah Thomas, and Eleanor, spread out in a loose line, watching the plantation through field glasses. Despite the late hour, the compound was brightly lit with torches along the walls and lanterns burning in many windows of the main house. Guards patrolled visibly, moving in pairs along the perimeter and checking the gates regularly. "They're expecting trouble," Miller observed grimly. "Someone must have warned them." "Or Blackwood is just being cautious," Thomas suggested. "After the ledgers were stolen—" Further discussion was cut short by a distant flash of light from the northern perimeter, the signal that all groups were in position and ready to begin. Miller nodded to a young man beside him, who lit a small torch and waved it 3 times in acknowledgement. Then they waited tense and silent for the diversion to begin. It came with startling suddenness, a series of explosions along the western wall, followed immediately by shouts and gunfire. Flames leapt up, illuminating the night sky, with an orange glow as a storage building near the main gate caught fire. "That's our cue," Miller said, already moving forward. "Remember the plan straight to the barracks. Free the women, head for the river crossing where the wagons are waiting." They advanced quickly, using the confusion of the main attack as cover. The guards on the eastern wall had turned to watch the commotion on the opposite side, most running, to assist with what appeared to be a major assault. Reaching the base of the wall, two men quickly set up a makeshift ladder, fashioned from rope and wooden slats. Miller went up first, cautiously peering over the top before signaling it was clear. One by one they climbed over, dropping down into the plantation grounds. Inside the wall, chaos reigned. The diversionary attack had drawn most of the guards away, but the sound of gunfire and shouting came from multiple directions, now evidence that the other groups had also breached the perimeter. "This way," Sarah whispered, leading them toward a long, low building about 50 yards from the wall. "That's the main barracks. The women are locked in at night." They moved swiftly through the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the scattered lanterns. Twice they had to freeze as guards ran past, but the men were focused on the more obvious threats elsewhere and didn't notice their small group. Reaching the barracks, they found the door secured by a heavy padlock. Miller made short work of it with bolt cutters, and they slipped inside to find a scene that stopped them cold. Two long rows of narrow cots lined the walls, most occupied by women of various ages. Some were already awake, alerted by the commotion outside. Others were just stirring confusion and fear evident on their faces. "We're here to help," Sarah announced, her voice steady and clear. "There's no time to explain. You need to come with us now. We're getting you out of here." Recognition dawned on some of the women's faces, not of Sarah personally, but of what she represented, one who had been captive long enough to witness a failed escape attempt. "It's a trick," one woman said fearfully. "They're testing us." "No trick," Ezra assured her, stepping forward. "Federal marshals are on their way from San Antonio. We have evidence of what Blackwood's been doing, but right now, we need to get you to safety." Uncertainty wavered on many faces until Eleanor pushed through to the front. "My name is Eleanor Hammond," she said, her dignified presence commanding attention. "I run the apothecary in Calico Springs. I've been working to free you and others like you for years. Please trust us. This is your chance." Something in her manner, grandmotherly but determined, seemed to reach them. One by one, the women began to rise, gathering what few possessions they had. "Where's Emma Miller?" Jacob asked urgently, scanning the faces. "My daughter, 19, blonde hair." An older woman stepped forward. "North Barracks," she said. "They keep the newer ones separate until they're broken in." Miller's face darkened with fury, but he controlled himself. "Where is it?" "I'll show you," Sarah offered. "Ezra, get these women to the meeting point. I'll go with Miller to the North Barracks." "We're splitting up," Ezra objected. "That wasn't the plan." "Plans change," she said firmly. "These women trust you now. Get them out. I'll be right behind you with the others." Before he could argue further, gunfire erupted nearby, much closer than before. The attack was escalating, spreading throughout the compound. "Go," Miller urged. "We'll meet at the river crossing." With reluctance born of fear for her safety, Ezra nodded. "Be careful," he told Sarah, touching her hand briefly. "Always," she replied, with a tight smile. Ezra, Thomas, Eleanor, and the remaining men began guiding the freed women toward the eastern wall. There were 23 in this barracks, ranging in age from perhaps 16 to well over 50. Some moved slowly, weakened by poor treatment or illness. Others seemed energized by the prospect of freedom, helping their less able companions. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the wall when a shout rang out behind them. A guard had spotted their group and was raising the alarm. Gunfire followed almost immediately, bullets kicking up dirt at their feet. "Run!" Ezra ordered, turning to return fire while Thomas and the others hurried the women forward. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of moments etched forever in memory. As the women fled toward the wall, more guards appeared from around a corner of the main house. Caught in the open, the group scattered, seeking whatever cover they could find. Ezra dropped one guard with a well-placed shot, then another. But there were too many, and his position was exposed. A bullet grazed his arm, spinning him halfway around. He recovered his balance and kept firing, determined to buy time for the others to escape. From the corner of his eye, he saw Eleanor ushering women over the wall, Thomas and Miller's men providing covering fire. Most had made it clear, but a few stragglers remained, including an elderly woman who had fallen and couldn't rise. Ezra ran to her, dodging bullets, and half-carried, half-dragged her toward the wall. They had almost reached it when a new sound cut through the gunfire, the deep, threatening bark of mastiffs. Blackwood had released his dogs. 3 massive animals charged across the open ground, bred and trained for exactly this purpose, preventing escapes. The lead dog was 30 yards away and closing fast when a shot rang out from an unexpected direction, dropping it mid-stride. Sarah appeared from the shadows near the north barracks, rifle raised, already sighting on the second dog. Her shot was true, but the third animal veered toward her, sensing a new threat. "Sarah!" Ezra shouted in warning, but he was too far away, still struggling to get the elderly woman to safety. What happened next seemed to unfold in terrible slow motion. Sarah turned to face the charging mastiff, but before she could fire again, a figure emerged from the darkness behind her, Mason Blackwood himself, pistol drawn. Ezra saw the muzzle flash, heard Sarah's cry of pain as she fell. The mastiff reached her a moment later, but Thomas, running from the wall, shot it at point-blank range before it could maul her. Blackwood disappeared back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Sarah lying motionless on the ground. Thomas kneeling beside her. With a cry of anguish, Ezra redoubled his efforts, getting the elderly woman to the wall, where Eleanor and one of Miller's men helped her over. Then he turned and ran toward Sarah, heedless of the bullets still flying around him. He reached her side to find Thomas pressing a cloth against a wound in her upper chest, his young face grim. "She's alive," he reported. "But it's bad, Doc. Real bad." Ezra's medical training took over, pushing aside emotion as he quickly assessed the damage. The bullet had entered just below her collarbone, missing the heart, but potentially damaging the lung. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored skin already taking on the waxy pallor of severe blood loss. "We need to get her out of here," he said, gathering her carefully in his arms. "Now." Thomas provided cover as they retreated to the wall where willing hands waited to help them over. The last of the freed women had already been escorted to the waiting wagons, and most of the rescue party was withdrawing, their mission accomplished despite the cost. Only Miller remained on the plantation side of the wall, his expression tortured. "Emma wasn't there," he said when Ezra questioned him. None of the women in the North Barracks had seen her for days. "Jacob, we have to go," Ezra insisted. "Sarah needs immediate care, and Blackwood is bringing in reinforcements." Indeed, they could hear the thunder of approaching horsemen, likely guards returning from patrols or neighboring properties owned by Blackwood's associates. With visible reluctance, Miller followed them over the wall. They retreated through the woods to where the wagons waited, loaded with the freed women. Sarah was placed in the last wagon, where Eleanor immediately began treating her wound as best she could, given the circumstances. "We need to get her to a proper surgery," she told Ezra. "This is beyond what I can manage in the field." "Calico Springs is closest," Thomas suggested. Ezra shook his head. "Too dangerous. Blackwood will have men watching the town. We need to head for San Antonio. The federal marshals can protect us there." The decision made their caravan began the long journey south, moving as quickly as possible while trying not to jostle the wounded. Besides Sarah, 3 men had been injured in the raid, though none as seriously. Ezra rode beside the wagon, carrying Sarah, dismounting frequently to check her condition. Eleanor had managed to slow the bleeding, but infection was a serious concern, and Sarah remained unconscious, her breathing increasingly labored. "She's strong," Eleanor assured him during one such stop. "She's survived worse than this." But Ezra, with his medical knowledge, recognized the gravity of her condition. Without proper surgery to remove the bullet and repair the damage, sepsis would set in within days. And even with surgery, her chances were uncertain at best. As dawn broke, they reached a small creek where they paused to rest the horses and tend to the wounded. The freed women, initially quiet with shock and disbelief at their sudden liberation, had begun to talk among themselves, sharing stories and offering comfort, those still struggling to process what had happened. Ezra sat beside the wagon, where Sarah lay holding her hand and monitoring her pulse. It was weaker than before, her skin hot with developing fever, despite the cool morning air. "Don't you dare give up," he whispered to her still form. "Not now. Not when we're so close." Whether it was his voice or simply coincidence, her eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a moment, her gaze seemed unfocused, confused. Then recognition dawned. "Ezra," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Did we free them?" "Yes," he assured her, squeezing her hand gently. 23 women from your barracks, 18 more from the North Barracks, all safe now." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good. That's good." She tried to say more, but was overcome by a fit of coughing that brought blood to her lips. Confirmation of Ezra's fear that the bullet had damaged her lung. "Don't try to talk," he urged. "Save your strength. We're taking you to San Antonio to a proper doctor." Sarah's eyes, though glazed with pain and fever, held a clarity that chilled him. "Not going to make it that far," she whispered once the coughing subsided. "Yes, you are," he insisted, his voice fierce with denial. "I didn't find you by that creek just to lose you now." Her hand tightened weakly around his. "Thank you for seeing me, for everything." "Sarah, listen to me," Ezra said, leaning closer. "You're going to live. We're going to get through this just like everything else. Remember what you told me? We fight together to the end." "And we did," she replied, her voice fading. "We won, Ezra. The others are free. That's enough." Before he could respond, her eyes drifted closed again, her breathing settling into the shallow rhythm of unconsciousness. Ezra remained beside her, monitoring every breath, willing her to keep fighting. They resumed their journey after a brief rest, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they left the relative flatlands around Calico Springs for the hill country that would eventually lead them to San Antonio. By midday, they had covered perhaps 15 miles, a good pace, given their circumstances, but still leaving at least 2 days of travel before reaching the city. Ezra knew with growing certainty that Sarah wouldn't survive that long without intervention. When they stopped again to water the horses at a small spring, he approached Miller, who had taken command of their caravan. "We need to find shelter," Ezra said without preamble. "Somewhere I can operate on Sarah. She won't make it to San Antonio otherwise." Miller considered this grimly. "There's a ranch about 5 miles southeast, belongs to a friend of mine. Has a clean house, good water. Might serve your purpose." "Lead the way," Ezra decided, "and send riders ahead to prepare them for our arrival." As they changed course toward the ranch, Ezra returned to Sarah's side, finding Eleanor bathing her feverish face with cool water. "She's getting worse," the older woman reported quietly. "The bullet needs to come out." "I know." Ezra checked the wound, finding the skin around it hot and swollen angry red streaks beginning to spread outward, the first signs of infection taking hold. "I'm going to operate as soon as we reach the ranch." Eleanor studied his face. "It's been a while since you practiced medicine, hasn't it?" 3 years, he admitted. "But before that, I performed hundreds of similar surgeries during the war, some under much worse conditions than we'll have at the ranch." "And the patient?" she asked gently. "Can you separate the doctor from the man who loves her?" The question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. His feelings for Sarah were hardly a secret, least of all to someone as perceptive as Eleanor. "I have to," he said simply. "She has no other chance." They reached the ranch by mid-afternoon, a modest but well-maintained property with a main house barn and several outbuildings. The owner, a weathered rancher named Carson, met them at the gate, already informed of their situation by Miller's advance rider. "My wife's preparing the dining room for your surgery," he told Ezra as they carried Sarah inside. "Best light in the house and a solid table. We've boiled water and clean linens as requested." The preparations were better than Ezra had dared hope. The dining table had been cleared and scrubbed windows opened to provide both light and ventilation. Carson's wife, a practical-looking woman with kind eyes, had assembled an array of items that might prove useful: additional lamps, basins of hot water, clean towels, and sheets. "I assisted our local doctor a few times," she explained. "Not with gunshots, but births and such. I know the importance of cleanliness." Ezra thanked her, then turned to the grim task of preparing for surgery. From his medical bag, the one possession he'd managed to save when his cabin burned, he produced surgical instruments carefully wrapped in oilcloth. They were relics of his army days, meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. Eleanor took charge of boiling the instruments while Ezra examined Sarah more thoroughly. The bullet was lodged deep, probably against a rib, after passing through the upper lobe of her left lung. Removing it would be difficult and dangerous, but leaving it would certainly prove fatal as infection spread. As final preparations were made, Thomas approached Ezra with news that further complicated their situation. "Riders coming from the north," he reported. "At least a dozen moving fast. Could be Blackwood's men." Ezra's heart sank. They'd hoped for more time before pursuit caught up with them. How long? An hour, maybe less. Not enough time for the surgery and recovery, Ezra realized. "We need to move the other women immediately. Get them to San Antonio as planned." Miller nodded agreement. "We'll leave half a dozen men here as guards. The rest of us will continue with the wagons, draw off any pursuit." The plan was quickly implemented. Most of the freed women, along with the less seriously wounded, departed within minutes, leaving only Sarah, Ezra, Eleanor, Thomas, and the promised guards at the ranch. As the dust from the departing wagons settled, Ezra returned to the makeshift operating room. Sarah lay unconscious on the table, her breathing increasingly labored, skin burning with fever. Eleanor had prepared laudanum should she wake during the procedure, but given her condition that seemed unlikely. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked, already wearing an apron and rolling up her sleeves to assist. Ezra took a deep breath, forcing himself to set aside his personal feelings and focus on the medical task at hand. He had performed similar surgeries countless times during the war: extraction of bullets, repair of damaged tissue, drainage of infection, but never on someone who meant so much to him personally. "Ready," he said, picking up a scalpel that gleamed in the afternoon light. "Let's begin."